Gamble cards in Yu-Gi-Oh! Are usually described as cards which have effects that are based somewhat on random chance, with most of them taking the form of performing a coin toss or rolling a 6-sided die, since these are two of the easiest extra materials that an average person should have access to pretty readily, and a vast majority of gamble cards rely on these two mechanics. Gamble cards in Yu-Gi-Oh! Are not very prevalent, and rarely do cards with gamble-like effects see competitive play. And why is that exactly? Let's take a look at another card game called Hearthstone, and more specifically a gamble card called Mind Control Tech. This is a pretty easy to summon minion, which has the effect that if your opponent controls 4 or more minions, you can take control of one of them at random. Now, the effect of just stealing one of your opponent's minions is just as valuable in Hearthstone as it is in Yu-Gi-Oh! However, not being able to choose which one you take control of means the card can completely win you the game on its own by stealing a strong boss monster, or gain you a nominal amount of advantage by stealing a small token instead. And Mind Control Tech was so swingy in its nature that it actually was placed on their version of a ban list for being too good of a gamble card. And Yu-Gi-Oh! Even has its own version of a gamble card that's too good in the form of 6 cents. This is a trap card which has the effect where you can declare 2 numbers from 1 to 6. Then your opponent gets to roll a 6-sided die. Based on the result of that roll, one of 2 things will happen. If the roll is equal to one of the numbers that you declared, you get to draw that many cards. If the roll is something else, you instead send that many cards from the top of your deck to the graveyard. So the best way to make use of 6 cents is to just declare the numbers 5 and 6. That way, if the roll is one of the higher numbers, you can draw 5 or 6 cards. And being able to draw 5 or 6 cards in the modern metagame is a huge advantage that can probably win you the game on its own. However, if you call the roll wrong, you also gain a beneficial effect, because sending cards from the top of your deck to the graveyard is useful in a lot of meta decks as well. So both of the gambling results of 6 cents are beneficial effects. It's just one of the effects can straight up win you the game on its own, while the other effect is just also good, but it's probably not going to win you the game. Mind Control Tech is the same way. If you're lucky, you can steal a very powerful monster your opponent controls and win the game. But if you're not, you still get a good effect. So if gamble effects in Yu-Gi-Oh! Went along this vein of having super broken good effects on a positive result, or just normal good result on a negative result, then we probably would have a lot more gamble cards in the game that I've seen play. However, 6 cents is more of an exception rather than the rule. If we take a look at some of the more earlier gamble cards, stuff like Time Wizard, Jirai Gumo, Graceful Dice, Skull Dice, or even Gamble, we have a wide variety of different types of gambling effects. In the case of Time Wizard, one of the most iconic gamble cards in the game, because it appeared heavily in the first anime, we have a low statted monster who has a simple heads or tails effect, where you get to call a coin toss, and if you call it correctly, you get to destroy all of your opponent's monsters, which is an excellent effect. However, if you call it incorrectly, you instead destroy all of your monsters, in addition to take damage equal to half the total attack of all the monsters that were destroyed on your side of the field. So Time Wizard falls into the category of good effect if you get it right, but terrible effect if you get it wrong. For gamble cards to be good, you need to also have a positive effect on that negative result, because you're still spending cards and losing card advantage to get the cards on the field. And if you spend a resource and don't actually advance the game state for doing so, then you just put yourself behind in card economy that can possibly lose you the duel right there. That's why having a singular card negate as part of your combos is so prevalent in the modern metagame strategies, where they're trying to put as many negates on the board as possible in order to out-card advantage your opponent through choice negates. So if the negative result not only does not give you any kind of positives, but is purely detrimental to you and can cause you to lose even more advantage, then it goes into the category of just not being worth using at all. It does fit more to the theme of gamble cards being, a gamble, but the gamble has to be so good that it can possibly win you the game in order to make up for that terrible downside. Time Wizard does have a good effect on its heads result, but itself requires your normal summon or using up a resource to cheat on the field. So if you waste your normal summon on Time Wizard and don't have any other extenders, your whole turn is basically summoning Time Wizard, hoping for a positive result, and you're rewarded with a 500 attack monster on the field that can't really do anything else. So its effect is just not really worth the risk. Even though the positive result is technically good, it's just not technically good enough. In the same vein, we also have Gamble, which is a trap card that has the condition where you can only activate this card if your opponent has 6 or more cards in their hand, and you have 2 or less cards in yours, where you get to toss a coin and call either heads or tails. And if you call it correctly, you get to draw until you have 5 cards in your hand. However, if you call it wrong, you skip your next turn. So, just like Time Wizard, it has an all-or-nothing gamble on a simple coin toss, where drawing 5 cards can possibly win you the game, or skipping your next turn will almost certainly lose you the game. And Gamble would be an excellent card if it wasn't for the activation requirement being really hard to set up. Unlike Time Wizard, trying to get a positive result on Gamble is actually worth putting resources into to an extent. It would be worth trying to get a heads result on Gamble. You might even play cards like Second Coin Toss in order to increase your chance to get a positive result from this card. But the game state required in order to even use the card, where your opponent needs to have more than 6 cards in their hand while you have almost none, just makes it too hard to activate, surprisingly enough, on top of the Gamble effect, maybe losing to the game if it doesn't resolve correctly. So it never saw any competitive play, but it was only half because of its actual Gamble effect. Then we have something like Jirai Gumo, another early Gamble card whose effect is just being a high stat and level 4 monster with 2200 attack, which would allow it to beat over pretty much any other level 4 monster in the game at the time, as the highest attack, most played level 4 monster was Zambra the Dark, which only had 2100 attack baseline. So the Gamble effect on Jirai Gumo was a little bit different to Time Wizard, in the fact that you always gain the benefits of the card no matter what, i.e. it being a 2200 attack level 4 monster. The gamble was whether or not you took a negative effect for declaring an attack, as whenever you attack with a card you'd have to call a coin toss, and if you called it wrong you would lose half your life points. However, the attack would still go through, so Jirai Gumo was actually not half bad when it comes to a gamble card, because its system of design wasn't an all-or-nothing gamble, and more of a gamble to see if you would take any kind of negative effect or not, for always having its positive effect available. But its positives were just not good enough, where you'd want to risk the downside of paying half your life points, because early Yu-Gi-Oh! Cared a lot more about the life points than modern Yu-Gi-Oh! Does, so most decks didn't really take that risk. And then we have the Fairy Dice cards. Graceful Dice allows you to roll a 6-sided die in order to increase the attack and defense of all your monsters by the result times 100. And Skull Dice was the opposite. You roll a dice in order to lower the attack and defense of all of your opponent's monsters by the result times 100. So, no matter what you result on the die, you were going to gain the beneficial effect from both of these cards. The gamble was simply to see if it was a bigger effect or a smaller one. And the problem with these two cards was that no matter what you rolled, the stat increase or decrease was just incredibly minor, where it didn't really matter. If you always rolled 6 on the result, that's not really worth going -1 in card advantage for. So, Graceful Dice and Skull Dice are in the camp of having a positive effect no matter what. It's just the positive effect in a best case scenario is not really worth running either of the cards for. So, there's no risk to getting in a low result either, if the high result is not better than just running a normal staple. Another category of gamble cards are monsters which have a gamble effect in order to copy the effect of another card that does not have a gamble effect tied to it. If we take a look at a card like Kryl, it has the effect where if it's sent to the graveyard as a result of battle, you're able to toss a coin. And if you call it correctly, you get to destroy one monster on your opponent's side of the field. The main benefit of Kryl over something like Man-Eater Bug is probably that it has more stats. Specifically, its defensive stats at 1700. So it could be more useful in the field if it eventually goes to the graveyard, by maybe surviving a battle phase and blocking out one attack first. But even then, we have cards like Snowman Eater, which have even better defensive stats and gain the positive effect much easier by just being flipped face up. And there's lots of other categories that gamble cards fall into. Sometimes they're there to curtail a positive effect, like Sasuke Samurai No. 4 having the ability to destroy a monster at the start of the damage step, but only if you call a coin toss correctly. But going over every other category that gamble cards fall into would probably be listing half of the gamble cards. So, this is just to give an example of some of the gamble cards in Yu-Gi-Oh! And gamble cards themselves only receive nominal support over the years, but never really a set that just had nothing but gamble support. Usually they just release random new gamble cards like Nice Foon or Blind Obliteration without really making a big deal of either of the gamble cards. But there have been a couple of archetypes of gamble-like mechanics inside of them. In 2003, they released the first wave of Archfiend cards, which were a series of fiend-type monsters that were based on chessboard pieces, and all shared an effect where they had targeted protection from effects, but only under a condition. Let's take a look at Shadow Knight Archfiend, for example. This is a 2000 attack level 4 monster, where it has a maintenance cost of 900 life points during each of your standby phases in order to keep it on the field. And if it's targeted by an opponent's card effect, you get to roll a 6-sided die. And if the result is exactly 3, you get to negate the effect and destroy that opponent's card. and also it halves any battle damage it deals to your opponent because it's a strong level 4 monster in 2003. And a lot of the early Archfiend cards were in this vein. Terror King Archfiend, the boss monster of the archetype, had an 800 life point maintenance cost, and if it was targeted by a card effect, you got to roll a 6-sided die. If the result was exactly 2 or 5, you got to negate the effect and destroy your opponent's card. Or if we take a look at the Summon Skull Retrain, which is part of the Archfiend archetype, and was outfitted to have the same effects as them, it has a 500 life point maintenance cost during the standby phase, and if it's targeted by a card effect, you can negate the effect if you roll a 6-sided die, and the result is 1, 3, or 6. So it has a 50% chance to negate targeted card effects. And they thought being able to sometimes negate a targeted effect was so good that these cards required a maintenance cost to be on the field, because obviously they were going to be broken if they could just be used like normal monsters. And the early Archfiends were terrible, and future iterations of Archfiends completely abandoned all of the mechanics of the early Archfiends, with only their Link monster paying homage to them, where it kind of does what they were trying to do, but better. It has a 500 maintenance cost during the standby phase, but also an effect where, if you pay life points, you can send a Fiend monster from your deck to the graveyard that has an attack or defense equal to the amount of life points you paid. And then it has a gamble effect, where if a Fiend-type monster is sent to the graveyard, you can roll a 6-sided die, and then apply one of its 3 effects based on the result. Where if the result is 1 exactly, you can add the card to your hand. If it's 2 to 5, it's shuffled back into the deck. Or if the result is 6 exactly, you get to special summon that card. So, the card only has a 1 in 3rd chance of having a positive effect by rolling a 1 or 6. However, there is a trap card called That 6, which will always treat a dice roll as either 6 or 1. So it at least has some combo potential to always gain a positive result. So the first wave of Archfiend cards with their gamble-like protection was just not very good. Even though having targeted protection is very good, it's just gambling on whether or not you actually get to be target immune was not enough to make all the mediocre monsters with low attack and maintenance costs see very much competitive success. In 2008, they released another gamble archetype in the form of the Arcana Force cards. These cards all have the gamble effects, where when this card is summoned you get to toss a coin, and depending on the coin toss it would gain one of 2 effects. Where the heads effect was almost always a positive effect, and the tails effect was usually negative. However, the tails effect was usually super negative, like in the case of Arcana Force 7, the Chariot, where if you got the tails result on its effect, you had to give control of the card to your opponent. Not all of them were as bad as the Chariot, but they were pretty close. Arcana Force 3, the Empress, had a tails effect, where each time your opponent normal summons a monster, you would have to send a card from your hand to the graveyard. Where its positive effect was simply that if your opponent normal summons a monster, you were allowed to special summon an Arcana Force monster from your hand. Special summoning monsters from your hand is technically a good effect, but waiting for your opponent to normal summon a monster to do this is too slow for it to be worthwhile. Whereas having a discard each time your opponent normal summons a monster is much worse. The Arcana Force cards kind of failed horribly, just like the early Archfiends. A lot of them had technically good effects with their positive heads effects, and even had some ways of kind of forcing the heads effects with their field spell card to Light Barrier, where it allowed you to choose the effect of the monster when it was summoned, but also required a coin toss each turn to see if you got to keep the effects or not. So the Arcana Force archetype did not see competitive play, even if a few of the cards in the archetype did see play. 3 of them to be exact. Arcana Force 0 the Fool, probably the most out of all of them. It has a gamble effect where, when this card is summoned, you get to toss a coin, and then the card will negate and destroy any card effect which targets the card, where if you got heads, it will negate your effects on the card, and if you get tails, it negates your opponent's effects on the card. So it's one of the few that has a positive tails effect rather than heads. However, this card was almost never summoned in a way where it would use its effect, as the reason this card saw play was because it had the effect where it can't be destroyed by battle. And battle immune monsters were kind of rare in 2008, where the few that did exist were actually limited on the ban list, so having an unlimited monster that was immune to battle destruction was pretty useful for some decks, especially if they needed a light or fairy type monsters. So Arcana Force 0 the Fool was not really used for its gamble effect at all, and just the other effect of the card. Same case for Arcana Force 14 Temperance, which was almost never used for its summon effect and instead for its hand effect, where you could discard this card from your hand in order to take no battle damage from a battle. In fact, Temperance sees a lot of play in Duel Links because of how valuable that effect is in that version of the game. The Arcana Force card that actually saw play for its gamble effect is Arcana Force 21, The World, where its heads effects has the effect that during your end phase, you can send 2 monsters you control to the graveyard to skip your opponent's next turn. And being able to skip your opponent's turn can kind of win you the game because of how powerful that effect is. So a danger deck took Arcana Force the World to an event, used a super combo that allowed them to turbo the card out as well as search out Light Barrier to guarantee its head effect, and then skip their opponent's turn in order to beat them with the extra board setup. And none of these 3 Arcana Force cards were played together in any of the decks that used them in competitive play. And the only reason Arcana Force 21 the World was able to see competitive play, even if it was only a single time, was because there was a way to guarantee its gamble effect to have a positive result. A lot of gamble cards don't have these kinds of reassurances, especially some of the cards that are built purely for what I assume Konami thought would be a gamble deck. Let's take a look at the Sand Gambler, Gambler of Legend, and Dice Jar. The Sand Gambler is a level 3 monster with only 300 attack, which has the effect where you toss a coin 3 times, and if all 3 results are heads, you get to destroy all of your opponent's monsters. But if the result is 3 tails, you instead destroy all of your monsters. So it's like a harder to use Time Wizard. Even though it was supposed to be meant as a pure gambling card, it doesn't actually have a better effect than one Time Wizard is able to do for a much easier result that can be somewhat controlled with Second Coin Toss. As Second Coin Toss, what this card allows you to do is once per turn negate the result of one coin toss in order to flip it again. If the card requires more than one coin toss like Sand Gambler, you can't really use Second Coin Toss, which actually made monsters who only toss a single coin for their effect a lot more valuable than ones who toss multiple, since they also introduced a card called Lucky Chance, where once per turn if a monster activates a coin toss effect which only tosses one coin, you get to then toss a coin and call heads or tails in order to draw one card after the effect resolves. And it wasn't until way later that they added support for cards that tossed multiple coins, with Proton Blast. This card wasn't released until 2018, 14 years after Sand Gambler, and it has the effect that once per turn, if an effect is activated which tosses coins, you can resolve its effects based on the number of heads you get, where you can inflict 500 points of damage to your opponent with 1 heads result, destroy 1 card your opponent controls with 2, or look at your opponent's hand and discard 1 card from their hand if you get 3 or more. And you can accumulate all 3 of these effects with multiple coin tosses, but you can only try once per turn. And it even has a graveyard effect, where if you activate an effect which tosses 2 or more coins, you can banish this card from your graveyard in order to treat all of the results as heads. So Proton Blast would have been excellent support for Sand Gambler in the early days of the game. Although, even being able to guarantee 3 heads results would probably not allow Sand Gambler to see play today, because the effect is just not good enough for all of that setup. 3 years after Sand Gambler, in 2007, they released the Gambler of Legend, which is an upgraded version that has the effect where you can toss a coin 3 times, and then apply the appropriate effect based on the number of heads, where if you get 3 heads, you destroy all of your opponent's monsters, just like Sand Gambler. If you only get 2 heads, you get to discard 1 random card from your opponent's hand. If you get 1 head, you have to destroy 1 of your cards, and if you get 3 tails, you have to discard your entire hand. So Gambler of Legend is a vast improvement over the original, of being a pure gambling card, as it has 2 possible positive effects. And then there's Dice Jar, which requires both players to roll a 6-sided die, and the player with the lower result takes damage equal to the result times 500. However, if someone wins the result by rolling a 6, the loser takes 6,000 damage instead. And if the result on both dice is the same, you just re-roll until you get a different result. So, if we were to take the pure gambled themed cards that are meant to work outside of archetypes and stand on their own, and put them into a deck with a whole bunch of support to allow their effects to go off better, and you were lucky enough to get heads results on pretty much everything, your win condition would be to hope your opponent has no forms of disruptions to stop your plays, because they can't really push for game on their own, and they can't really deal enough damage to win unless you're able to resolve Dice Jar's effect twice with the 6 roll. Part of the problem with gamble cards is that pure gamble cards just do such a bad job of being staples that they can't really be played in a normal deck in order to complement their plays. And they simultaneously don't fit in their own decks of just gamble effects either. So the only way gamble cards have been able to see competitive play is if they fit into a distinction of being a good staple that happens to interact well with an archetype, if you're able to make use of the negative side effects, or if it's part of an archetype which allows you to circumvent a lot of its effects. And there have been some other cards that fit into all of those other categories. To continue the video on gamble cards and failed mechanics, we're actually going to be going over a lot of successful gamble cards over the game's history, starting off with some of the gamble staples. With these, we have number 85 Crazy Box, Fairy Box, Blowback Dragon, number 7 Lucky Straight, Snipe Hunter, and of course, 6 Cents. All of these gamble cards were played as staple cards that happen to fit in with the theme of a particular deck. Let's start with number 85 Crazy Box. This is a generic rank 4 monster with 3000 attack and has the effect where it cannot attack. But it has an effect to detach one of its materials in order to roll a 6-sided die, where you can gain 1 of 6 effects. The reason Crazy Box saw play was because it was a 3000 attack beat stick, which you could just have its effect negated with something like Skill Drain in order to have easy access to a beat stick sometimes, or just a high attack monster on the field for other kinds of effects. It wasn't really played because of its gamble effect at all. Fairy Box is a continuous trap card where each time your opponent declares an attack, you're able to toss a coin and call heads or tails. And if you call it correctly, you get to reduce that monster's attack to 0, which could result in it getting destroyed if it was attacking into one of your monsters. And on a negative result, simply nothing happens. So it was kind of the case of, you constantly got to try for a very positive effect, and didn't really get anything bad if it happened to fail that result, other than maybe your opponent attacking you directly when you really needed to reduce their attack to 0. And Dark Sanctuary has a similar effect, but without a maintenance cost every time. Blowback Dragon is a level 6 monster with 2300 attack that has the effect where once per turn you can target any card your opponent controls, and then toss a coin 3 times. And if at least 2 of the results are heads, you get to destroy that card. So Blowback Dragon was played a lot in early Chaos decks, or just decks that could facilitate a tribute summon, because Blowback Dragon had decent stats for a level 6 monster at 2300, and had a chance to destroy back row in addition to monsters, even if it wasn't guaranteed. Plus it was dark attribute, so it could be useful in the graveyard later, while also having all the other benefits described. Number 7, Lucky Straight, is a rank 7 Xyz monster which requires 3 level 7 monsters as materials, which means it's actually kind of hard to bring out. And it has the effect where you can detach one of its materials in order to roll a 6-sided die twice, where its attack becomes the larger of the 2 rolls times 700 until the end of your opponent's next turn, where you then gain an additional effect if both of the dice results happen to add up to exactly 7. So if you rolled a 5 and a 2, a 3 and a 4, for example, etc., etc. You then got to choose one of 3 special effects, where you can either send all other cards in the field to the graveyard, special summon 1 monster from your hand or either player's graveyards, or draw 3 cards and discard 2. All 3 of these effects were really good, much better than the effects of Gambler of Legend even, and that's supposed to be a pure gambling card. And it's easier to get a sum of 7 when rolling 2 dice than it is to get 3 heads. The chance of getting 3 coin tosses on heads in a row is 1 in 8, or 12.5%. The chance of getting a sum of 7 on 2 dice rolls is 1 in 6, or 16.67%. So, if it's only slightly higher, why did a super gamble-focused card like Lucky Straight see competitive play, and even a ton of competitive play at that? Well, its effect is not once per turn, and it has 3 materials, which means when brought out, you could immediately try 3 times for an exact 7 dice result. And also, because it's an extract monster that can be special summoned, you don't have to waste up your normal summon to bring it out or any main deck space. And it's perfect for the type of thing that gamble cards are trying to go for, of just maybe having a really good effect if you're lucky, and it just being an option that you can summon. But its materials were really hard to work with, except for the fact that Dragon Rulers were able to spam out level 7 monsters like no other archetype has been able to do since. Dragon Rulers were kind of the king of having too many level 7 monsters in the field that they didn't know what to do with. So a lot of the times, Dragon Rulers would play Lucky Straight as just an option for mirror matches, where there were a lot of board states that Dragon Rulers just couldn't deal with, so a way of trying to deal with them was by using Lucky Straight and getting the ability to send all cards in the field to the graveyard. It was basically played because they didn't really have any other options that didn't target, and they could go into it very easily, and at the very least they could try for a high beat stick, because if they rolled a 6 on one of their results, it would have 4900 attack. So it still wasn't a super successful gamble card, but it came very close. Then we have Snipe Hunter, which absolutely was a successful gamble card. Probably the most successful gamble card outside of 6 cents. Snipe Hunter is a level 4 monster with 1500 attack, which has the effect where you can discard 1 card, then target 1 card in the field and roll a 6-sided die, where if the result of the dice roll is anything but 1 or 6, you're able to destroy that card. Which means you have a 2/3 chance of getting a positive result, or a 1 in 3 chance of losing a discard from your hand with no positive result. And what made Snipe Hunter an absolute unit of a gamble card that saw more competitive success than any other gamble card in the game's history was the fact that its effect was not once per turn, and had a higher than a 50% chance to succeed, as a 2/3 chance comes out to around 66.7%. So, you have a higher chance of resolving Snipe Hunter's positive effect than you do of calling a coin toss correctly. And it was this tiny little boost in probability that allowed it to actually be very successful, especially since your opponent didn't actually know the result of the dice roll until the effect resolved. So, if you targeted one of your opponent's back row cards with Snipe Hunter's effect, they would have to choose to activate the effect immediately or risk the effect landing a positive result and getting the card destroyed before they got a chance to chain it. And since Snipe Hunter allowed you to basically use your entire hand to try to destroy your opponent's field, it was great for decks that love to ditch their cards from their hand to the graveyard in targeted amounts. So Snipe Hunter saw a ton of play in 2007 shortly after it came out, as an unlimited amount of targeted destruction was just unheard of at the time. And it was mostly played in decks that wanted cards in the graveyard, and was played alongside the Card Trooper, Machine Duplication, Dark Magician to Chaos into a Metamorphosis, Cyber Twin Dragon OTK with limited removal combo. Then in 2008 and 2009 it saw a ton of play in Dark Arm Dragon decks, before then seeing another resurgence in 2013 with Dragon Rulers, as a way to ditch all of them into the graveyard while destroying your opponent's cards in the field. So Snipe Hunter saw immediate impact when it first came out in all kinds of decks, then was used as a semi-staple in one of the few Tier 0 decks in the game's history, and then used again in another pseudo Tier 0 deck with Dragon Rulers. You can't really have a more impressive record than Snipe Hunter, where the only card that could possibly beat it out in terms of playability, and also being a pure gamble card, would definitely have to be Sixth Sense, if it wasn't banned almost immediately after its introduction. So those are the gamble cards which happen to fit into other decks as staples. We also have gamble cards which were used because they don't care if their negative effect happens or not. Although that category is incredibly small, to the point where I can only really think of 3 of them, that being Cup of Ace, Fiend Comedian, and Paths of Destiny. The Paths of Destiny has the effect where both players toss a coin, and if the result is heads, you gain 2,000 life points, but if the result is tails, you take 2,000 points of damage. This card was played with bad reaction to Samochi decks, where no matter the result of your opponent's coin toss, they would take 2,000 points of damage, which is a ton of damage to take from one card. And with Cup of Ace, it simply has the effect where you toss a coin, and heads, you draw 2 cards, tails, your opponent draws 2 cards. It was occasionally played in OTK/FTK decks that were trying to just draw a whole bunch of cards in one turn, because a lot of those decks would try to use cards like Hand Destruction in order to cycle through their deck faster. But Hand Destruction requires your opponent to have 2 cards in their hand in order to use and resolve the effect. So a lot of players were able to counter these FTK deck strategies by just setting everything in their hand during their turn. So Cup of Ace allowed you to actually give your opponent 2 cards so that you can continue all of your plays like normal, or if you got a heads, you just draw 2 cards, which was good as well. And Fiend Comedian has the effect where if you toss a coin and call it, and you get a correct result, you get to banish all cards in your opponent's graveyard. But if you call it wrong, you send a number of cards from the top of your deck to the graveyard, equal to the number of cards in your opponent's graveyard. So on a positive result, you banish all the cards in your opponent's graveyard, which is good. And a negative result, you get to mill a whole bunch of cards, which is also good. So Fiend Comedian actually saw a lot of play in Lightsworn and Infernoid decks that love to mill cards. And outside of the examples I listed in these 2 past sections, that's pretty much it when it comes to cards that saw widespread competitive play while also being a gamble card. Now let's go over a different category of gamble cards, random gamble cards that are part of archetypes that are normally not about gambling. This category is incredibly small, and I can only really think of 2 examples. First are Morphtronics. They have 2 level 1 monsters that have effects that are correlated to rolling dice. Morphtronic Smart Fawn has the effect that while it's in attack position, once per turn you can roll a 6-sided die. Look at that many cards at the top of your deck, then add 1 Morphtronic card from your deck to your hand amongst the ones you looked at. And then it has a defense position effect where you can just look and rearrange the top cards of your deck equal to a dice roll. The other level 1 Morphtronic is Morphtronic Cellphon, which is a little bit better, as its effect is to roll a 6-sided die to look at the top cards of your deck equal to the dice result. However, you then get to special summon a level 4 or lower Morphtronic monster amongst them, ignoring its summoning conditions. And its defense effect is to simply look at the top cards of your deck equal to a dice result, but then just return them to the deck in the same order. So Morphtronic Cellphon's attack position effect is the better of the 2, because it potentially allows you to special summon a monster from your deck without a cost. So if you get Morphtronic Cellphone on the field, successfully resolve its effect by special summoning a single monster, then you just went +1 in card advantage from your deck, which is actually really good, especially since it can special summon other copies of itself to try the effect again. The gamble nature of its effect is simply to rein in how good that effect actually is by not allowing you to just pick any target from your deck. Although there is a chance you can roll a 1 and then the top card of your deck is not a Morphtronic monster at all, and you don't get to special summon any monsters. Morphtronic Cellphon does see play Morphtronic decks as kind of a staple card to get their plays going, but Morphtronics are not a competitive deck. Probably because one of their best cards has a gamble effect tied to its good effect. Then if you look at the Speedroid archetype, they also randomly have a good card with a gamble effect called Speedroid Wheel. This is a quick play spell card which requires you to discard 1 card to activate it, then you get to roll a 6-sided die. Based on the result of that dice roll, you then get to special summon 1 or 2 monsters from your hand or deck. just as long as the levels of those monsters is equal to the result of your dice roll, but their effects are negated. However, if you're not able to summon a monster, you lose life points equal to the result of the roll times 500. So if you roll a 6, for example, you can special summon 2 level 3 monsters from your deck. And with the discard cost, this is card neutral and card advantage, but being able to discard in order to special summon 2 monsters from your deck is incredibly good. So the random nature of the dice roll is there in order to rein in that really good effect, just like Morphtronic Self-On. And because of the random nature of the card, it's not super reliable to actually use. And there is the possibility that you'll only be able to summon 1 monster, or not that at all if you just happen to roll a result where you don't have cards to special summon. Although with a possible upside to its effect, and with how most of the Speedroid monsters are low level anyway, I'm curious to see if Speedroid Wheel will actually be a staple part of the Speedroid archetype or not, because it is a rather new card that was released in 2021. Konami does still release new gamble-like effects randomly. The fact that Speedroid's got a random dice roll related card is probably because some of their cards have dice in their artwork. But they also just randomly release new gamble-like cards all the time anyway. Some of the more recent examples of modern gamble cards they've released randomly are Head Judging and Diced Dice. Diced Dice was released at the end of 2020 and is a quick play spell card, which has the effect to roll a 6-sided die. And if you roll a 1 or 6, you get to search any card from your deck that requires a die roll. However, if you fail, which is more than likely since you only have a 1 in 3 chance of succeeding, then you get to roll another 6-sided die to determine what happens next. Where if you happen to roll a 1 or 6, you get to return this card to your hand. But since the card itself has a hard once per turn, you won't be able to try for its effect again until your next turn. But if you roll a 2 to 5, you place the card on top of your deck instead, which means you'll probably get to try again on your next turn, but it's taking up your normal draw, which is pretty bad. This card was most likely created in order to interact with that 6, to always force a result of 1 or 6 on a die roll. Head Judging was released in 2020 and is a continuous trap card which has the effect where if a monster activates its effect on the field, you can choose to make the activating player toss a coin and call it. If they call it correctly, then Head Judging destroys itself. If they call it incorrectly, however, then the activation of the effect is negated, and you get to change control of that monster to your opponent. So Head Judging has the potential to both negate the effect of one of your opponent's monsters, and then take control of it, and it forces the coin toss on your opponent. However, if they simply call it correctly, then the card immediately goes to the graveyard and you go -1 in card advantage. But if you're successful, you go +2 in card advantage with that steal. And then you'll get to use it again on your next turn since it's a continuous trap card with only a hard once per turn limitation on its effect. Head Judging saw all of no play in the regular TCG, but it is currently semi-limited in Duel Links. In Duel Links, gamble decks have been a lot more successful because they have skills in the game which allow you to force positive results, like one of the most famous ones, Master of Destiny, for example, which allows the first 3 coin tosses you make in a duel to always land on heads. So, this skill turns Cup of Ace into a pure pot of greed, without any chance of getting the negative effect. And that skill was very good and kind of overpowered, especially since they also released Desperado Barrel Dragon in the game at around the same time the skill was added, which actually gave gamble decks a decent boss monster to rally behind. Desperado Barrel Dragon can special summon itself from your hand if a Dark Machine type monster you control is destroyed by battle or card effect. During the battle phase, you can forego its attack in order to toss a coin 3 times, where you can then destroy a number of face-up monsters in the field up to the number of heads. And you gain an extra effect where if you get 3 heads, you also get to draw 1 card. Then, if this card is sent to the graveyard in any way, you get to add a level 7 or lower monster from your deck to your hand that has a coin toss in effect. So, Desperado could bring itself out from your hand with BM4 Blast Spider, destroying one of your opponent's cards. It could then destroy all of your opponent's cards during the battle phase, and it could search out another coin toss card from your deck if it was sent to the graveyard from the field or hand, as you could use it as a full cost for something like Arcana Force in order to bring itself out. And then search out one of your coin toss effects. And not only was this gamble deck good in Duel Links, it was kind of oppressive, to the point where they had to nerf a lot of the cards involved. So there's a couple of gamble cards that are on their ban list purely to reduce the power level of Master of Destiny decks. And this was after they nerfed the skill itself multiple times. Having guaranteed head results is just that powerful, especially in a low power level version of the game like Duel Links. Which kind of leads into the last point of the video. What could they do if they wanted gamble effects to be more competitive? Duel Links already kind of solved that problem by just allowing you to guarantee the positive result of those gamble effects. In order to play Master of Destiny, your deck needs to have 7 or more cards with different names that require a coin toss. And it even skips your first draw phase during the duel, so you start off with a -1 in card advantage. And even with all of those restrictions on the deck building and the direct negative to your card advantage, they still had to limit a whole bunch of the cards to rein in that deck's power level. So, if in the TCG, they created an archetype all about allowing you to force positive results on gamble effects, that would probably elevate them to competitive status, although the way they could do that without any skills in the normal game is kind of difficult to think about, because it would require them to pretty much create an entire archetype around this concept, where they wouldn't really need to use the old gamble cards anyway. So outside of creating a whole new archetype that's kind of like the Master of Destiny skill from Duel Links, what they could do is create gamble cards that have effects more similar to Sixth Sense or Graceful Dice, where you just have varying levels of positive successes, and you don't actually get a negative effect at all for using the card. If we were to take a look at something like Dice Foon as an example of something to fix, Dice Foon has the effect on a quick play spell card that has a chance to destroy spell or trap cards on the field. Since it's a quick play spell card, it has all of the benefits of MST, but it has the terrible downside where, if you roll a 1 or 6, not only does it not destroy a card, but you take 1,000 points of damage. So because the card has a 1 in 3 chance of being purely detrimental, it doesn't really see competitive play in the TCG. If we were to fix this card in order to make it more playable, what you could do is change that 1 in 6 effect, where instead of having the card having a purely detrimental effect to you, it could have a lesser positive effect instead, of maybe only destroying a face-down spell or trap card. That way, all possible effects on its dice roll would have a positive effect, and that would probably make the card actually see play and not really be overpowered in any way. And in fact, Konami kind of did this when they created the new fusion card for Time Wizard, where its effect is to destroy all monsters on the field, and the coin toss simply determines if you or your opponent takes life point damage equal to half the original attack of the destroyed monsters. And also, Desperado Barrel Dragon is a good example of a gamble card because its effect has such a small chance of having a negative effect, as during the battle phase it's able to toss a coin 3 times and destroy a number of face-up monsters equal to the result of heads. So, you have a 12.5% chance of getting 3 tails, which would result in no cards getting destroyed and only giving up your attack in order to activate that effect, which means nothing if you're using this effect during your opponent's battle phase. So, if they were to make a gamble card suck less, what they could do is just make the effect always do something positive and only have a better positive effect if it fully succeeds. Even Snipe Hunter would be improved if it actually did something useful on its 1 or 6 result, as the reason it stopped seeing play after Dragon Rulers was because the effect is just not good enough in the modern metagame for a main deck monster that requires your normal summon. Because even if the effect has a 100% chance to destroy a targeted card with its cost, it probably wouldn't be good enough to see play today. Just to give an example of how far the game has progressed since 2013. In fact, we can be pretty certain it wouldn't see any play, seeing as they unbanned Tribe Infecting Virus, which can discard 1 card to potentially destroy all of your opponent's monsters without a gamble, on a non-once per turn effect as well, and it doesn't see any competitive play at all. So, in conclusion, the reason gamble cards don't really work in Yu-Gi-Oh! Is because a lot of them are bad. And the best gamble cards in the game are ones that were useful for things besides its gamble effect, had a higher than 50% chance to succeed that gamble effect while also being useful for other things, or had a positive effect no matter the outcome of the gamble, and there were almost no exceptions to these rules. Many people consider the dice roll to be the most important parts of a match, though they're usually referring to one that determines whether you go first or second. In this video, we're going over the best cards in the game with an effect that roll dice. Starting us off at number 10, we have Roulette Barrel. This is a level 4 light machine monster with 1,000 attack and 2,000 defense. It can, once per turn, roll a 6-sided dice, and then you can pop a monster in the field whose level is equal to one of the results. Roulette Barrel saw some play as a tech option in some earlier Yu-Gi-Oh! Formats. This is because back then, the game was focused almost entirely on the Chaos monsters, who all needed to banish a light and dark monster from your graveyard to special summon themselves. While there was no shortage of good dark monsters to run, with the likes of Break of the Magical Warrior, Sandgun, Mystic Tomato, you were a bit limited when it came to light monsters. It didn't help that one of the best lights from the time, DD Warrior Lady, banished itself if you ever used its effect either. This made people opt for some weirder options just to fill their light count quota, and Roulette Barrel was just barely good enough to see play. While its effect only has a 1 in 3 effect to destroy an opponent's monster most of the time, being able to get rid of one of your opponent's recruiters or monarchs for free was something no other card could do. While it wasn't the best stat-wise either, well at least when it came to attack, at least it was a 2,000 defense defender. Just good enough to live through a battle phase to be used as tribute fodder in your next turn. Being a defensive wall with a small added upside was just barely good enough to let it see some play. But you were probably better off playing a more proactive card like Blade Knight in your Chaos deck most of the time. And as more and more lights came out, there was only less and less reason to be on Roulette Barrel, so it hasn't been on a competitive deck since 2005. And now at number 9, we have Dice Jar. This is a level 3 light rock flip monster with meager stats, and the effect to make both players roll a 6-sided die when flip face up. The player with the lowest roll then takes damage equal to their opponent's roll times 500. But if the winner rolled a 6, the loser takes 6,000 damage instead. Finally, if both rolls are the same, both players just roll again. When it comes to raw burn damage potential, Dice Jar is probably still the strongest card in the game when it comes to both damage dealt and little setup needed for it. The downside is that, well, you're only going to be burning your opponent about half the time you resolve it. And you're only ever getting the full burn damage less than 15% of the time. Sure, you could increase your odds by using a card like that 6, but at that point you're probably better off just going for a 2-card combo that didn't need to resolve a flip monster, like using Bad Reaction to Samochi with Gift Card. Dice Jar was mostly passed up for consistent means of doing burn damage, such as Death Koala, which just inflicts a flat 400 damage for each card in your opponent's hand. With all of this said, this card did manage to get a couple of tops to its name in the dedicated burn strategies. Mostly as a singleton and often in the side deck where it probably never got sided in, but it was still there. Dice Jar kind of exemplifies why gamble cards rarely see play, as this kind of high risk, high reward gambit isn't suited for real tourneys where you need a consistent win rate at top. Still, there's little that would be more devastating than getting eliminated from a big tourney because your opponent got a natural 6 on a Dice Jar. And at number 8, we have Dark Master Zork. This is a level 8 Dark Fiend Ritual monster with 2700 attack. It can be Ritual 7 with Contract with the Dark Master. Its effect is that once per turn, you can roll a 6-sided die, and then if you roll a 1 or 2, you can destroy all monsters your opponent controls. If it's a 3, 4, or 5, you can destroy one monster your opponent controls, and lastly, if it's a 6, it destroys all monsters you control. Differently from the last spot, Zork gives you some pretty decent odds of getting a good effect on a dice roll. Still, it makes up for it by having an even more detrimental downside, as if you roll a 6, you're just losing your whole board on the spot. Zork saw some play in Demise OTK for a bunch of different reasons, but none of them were related to its effect. Since it has the same level as Demise, it could be used as the entire tribute cost for it, and was easily searchable through one of the several ritual searchers like Maju and Senju. Though usually you wanted to summon Demise through advanced ritual art, lots of decks did run a generic ritual summoning card like Contract with Abyss, just in case you'd emptied out your deck of vanillas for advanced ritual art already. The main idea behind Demise OTK was to use advanced ritual art to bring out Demise and dump insects to the graveyard with it, so that you can blow up the field with Demise's effect, and then use Doom Dozer to swing for a lot of damage. Zork was a fun inclusion in Demise, and it had the small niche of being able to beat over Monarchs and Demise itself, but it was never the scariest part of the strategy during any point in which it was viable. And at number 7, we have Speedroid Wheel. This is a quick play spell that requires you to discard a card to be activated, and then you roll a 6-sided die. Afterwards, you get to special summon up to 2 Speedroid monsters from your deck whose total levels equal the result, but their effects are negated. And if you did not have any targets for this card, you lose life points equal to the die's result times 500. Speedroid Wheel, despite being technically a gamble card, is one of the most consistent extenders for dedicated Speedroid decks. While it may seem quite dangerous to leave the effectiveness of your plays up to a dice roll, the result you get with Wheel usually doesn't matter too much. As long as you roll 2 or more, you can use it to get 2 bodies straight from your deck at the small cost of a discard. Pretty much any archetype would love to have a card like this, as cards like Emergency Teleport and Zodiac Barrage, which bring out a single monster from the deck, have both earned themselves places on the Forbidden Limited list for being too strong. While the 2 monsters do get their effects negated, all the archetype usually needs is having bodies in the field to get into their Link 2, High Speed Roid Rubber Band Shooter. From there, you've got many ways to bring back those monsters you summoned from the grave to be able to use their effects, such as Speedroid Recovery, an archetypal monster reborn that gives you follow-up. Even if this card doesn't punish you a lot for rolling low, it still nicely rewards you if you manage to get 4 or higher, as you can bring out monsters with graveyard effects as well, like Speedroid Den Den Daiko Duke. Even if pure Speedroids hasn't been the most meta archetype out there, Speedroid Wheel is still a great example of how good a gamble card has to be for people to want to play it. And at number 6, we have number 67, Paradise Smasher. This is a rank 5 light fairy Xyz monster which can be made with 2 or more level 5 monsters. It has the effect to, during your main phase 1 only, detach 2 materials from itself to make both players roll 2 6-sided dice, and then the player who rolls the highest result cannot activate monster effects or declare an attack until the end of the next turn. Also, once per turn, if a player rolls a die while this card is material, you can treat one of the results as 7. Paradise Smasher has one of the strongest effects in the game locked behind its dice roll. Being able to lock your opponent on monster effects and attacking for a turn is the same as winning the game on the spot against most decks which have seen play recently. True King of All Calamities had basically the same effect, and it was one of the most hated cards by the player base up until it finally got itself banned as soon as it became easy enough to summon. Paradise Smashers can give you the same effect as it did on a rank 5, but due to the way the effect works, it can just as well backfire and lock you out of the game instead. However, differently from other gamble cards, this monster actually comes with a way to increase the odds of its own effect going through. If you manage to still have Xyz materials after using the effect, which can be done by either making it with 3 level 5s or ranking it up, you get to manipulate one of the dice rolls to be 7. By being able to change one of the results, you actually get way better odds to roll lower than your opponent. They actually come to about 90% or so being favorable towards you. So why hasn't Paradise Smasher seen play then? Well, because even if 90% is high, it's never guaranteed. Why would you play a combo deck that has a 90% chance to win if combos go through, when you could instead play a deck that locks your opponent out almost as well, but without relying on a gamble instead? And at number 5, we have number 85, Crazy Box. This is a generic rank 4 Dark Fiend monster with 3000 attack. It cannot attack, and once per turn you get to roll a 6-sided die and apply one of its effects depending on its result. If it's 1, your life points get halved. If it's 2, you draw a card. 3, your opponent discards a card. And 4, you get to negate the effects of a face-up card in the field. 5, you destroy a card in the field, and finally 6 makes the card destroy itself. This card actually has a pretty decent chance to give you a good effect after the dice roll. Only 2 out of the 6 aren't beneficial to you. And even then, only one of those will actually make you go minus in card advantage. Still, even though this card did see a lot of play during the Xyz era, it was never because of its effects. Even back then, you didn't really have to gamble if you wanted removal or to draw a card off a rank 4, as you already had Silent Honor Arc, Excited Knight, and Daigusto Emerald to fulfill those kinds of roles. The reason why people played this card was because it was the highest statted rank 4 of the game at 3000 attack, even beating the designated high attack rank 4 of the time, Gem Knight Pearl. Of course, its attack usually wouldn't matter as it can't attack, but this card was played exclusively to be a huge beater while under skill drain. Decks which played this floodgate usually did so because they had an easy time fielding huge beaters, such as Dragon Rulers and Grapha, and Crazy Box was just big enough to challenge all of those when its effects were negated. This is the first card on this list to have actually seen a lot of competitive play, even if it was just when its effects wouldn't get in the way. And at number 4, we have Blind Obliteration. This is a normal trap card which makes you roll a 6-sided die twice and destroy all face-up monsters in the field with a level and rank lower than the total result. This card saw a little bit of play during Zodiac format as a great way to deal with your opponent's board. Since all the zoos are level or rank 4, you only need to roll about that much to make this card into a dark hole at quick effect speed. These odds were just barely reliable enough, as the next best card, Torrential Tribute, was limited to 1 at the time. After the Northern combo nonsense was addressed, Zodiac Mirror shifted to be much more grindy than ever before. Decks would max out on all kinds of spot removal and 1-for-1s like hand traps and kaijus to try to deal with your opponent's Zodiac Trident. Trident mirrors would often come down to whoever managed to get their monsters to stick for a whole turn first, and a card like Blind Obliteration was a great way to try to equalize the game when you were behind on board. One of the biggest advantages this card had over other similar techs was that it couldn't be hit by My Body as a Shield. That card had become increasingly popular to run in the main and side deck to protect your Zodiacs, since it can negate an effect that would destroy a monster on the field. However, since Blind Obliteration is not guaranteed to destroy anything, as it could roll through a lower and fizzle, it would never be hit with My Body. This card was one of the many reasons people opted to go with Pianissimo instead, as it couldn't be played around as well as My Body could, but just like that card, these both were quickly forgotten once zoos were banned off the meta. And at number 3, we have Morphtronic Telephon. This is a level 1 Earth Machine Tuner monster. When it's in attack position, it can roll a 6-sided die in order to gain life points equal to the result times 100. Then you can special summon a Morphtronic monster with a level equal to or lower than the result from your graveyard. When it's in defense position, you get to excavate cards from the top of your deck equal to the dice roll, and then send an excavated Morphtronic card to the graveyard. The most impressive thing about Telephon is its lack of a hard once per turn on either effect, which is something newer cards tend to avoid. It also does not exclude itself from summoning another copy of Morphtronic Telephon from your graveyard. Since this monster is level 1, that means any result on your dice roll means you get to bring back another copy from the graveyard. So if you have a way of getting Telephon on the field and one in the grave, you can continuously link off and bring back Telephons with cards like Link Cerebral to have access to almost infinite fodder. This can not only get you a lot of bodies for link summoning, it can also be used as an FTK engine instead. If instead of linking off the extra Telephons, you use a Cannon Soldier to send to the graveyard, you can inflict 8,000 points of damage to your opponent on the first turn of the game. The unique part about this FTK is that even if you're prevented from doing burn damage, like being under the effect of your own Dark Ruler No More, it also allows you to gain infinite life points because Telephon also increases your life points. This loop hasn't seen much relevancy in the TCG because its 2 best enablers, Crystron Halki Fibrax and Curious, got banned not long after Telephon's release. But the Telephon remains one of the easiest FTK loops to execute that are currently in the game, and is technically a card which has a dice roll as part of its effect. And at number 2, we have Snipe Hunter. This is a level 4 Dark Fiend monster with 1500 attack and the effect to pitch a card to target a card in the field and roll a 6-sided die. Then you destroy that target unless you roll a 1 or 6. Despite being a gamble card, Snipe Hunter was one of the biggest staples in early Yu-Gi-Oh's history. It had just the right stats to be an okay beater while in the field, while also a tutorable from the deck with Mystic Tomato. It's a dark, which helped fuel a lot of Chaos Center strategies, helping you fill your requirements for Chaos Sorcerer or Dark Realm Dragon. It did so doubly well because the effect allowed you to discard cards indefinitely, as the effect is not once per turn. This lets you get rid of cards which might be bad in your hand but good on the graveyard, like Destined Hero Malicious, while also popping your opponent's field. Of course, you only had a 2 in 3 chance of actually destroying the targeted card for each of your discards, but sometimes being able to fill up your graveyard was more than good enough. Snipe Hunter was played mostly in Teledad as one of the first tier 0 strategies in the game's history. which centered around Emergency Teleport and Dark Arm Dragon, both cards which had to be hit to 1 for several years afterwards. It lost its main home when the deck was banned off the game, but it was still good enough to see play in a couple of random strategies in time. In the Synchro era, this card was a good answer to Stardust Dragon, as since its effect is not guaranteed to destroy something, it cannot be negated by Stardust. Overall, Snipe Hunter has to be the most popular dice-related card in Yu-Gi-Oh's history, and it's only not number 1 because of the raw power of the next spot. And finally, at number 1, we have 6 Cents. This is a normal trap card which requires you to declare 2 numbers from 1 to 6 and then roll a 6-sided die. If the result is one of those 2 numbers, you get to draw that many cards from your deck, and if not, you mill that many cards on top of your deck instead. 6 Cents is by far the strongest effect that has anything to do with dice in the game, as it's actually the only gamble card that's banned. This card has a bit of an interesting story for the TCG, as we only got it a decade after the OCG did, and it was never playable at 3 because it got limited instantly upon release. 6 Cents was only around for a single format, but it was enough to ruin the game for a few months during the Dragon Rule era. The impact this card had on the game was impossible to deal with, as if it resolved favorably, it would win you the game on the spot. The obvious way to use it might just be call 5 or 6, as that would offer you the highest payoff, but what most people did during the format was call 3 or 4. This is because drawing 3 or 4 cards was already enough to win you the game, but also since the rules were all pretty good in the graveyard, milling 5 or 6 cards would also be good enough to give you the game. In this way, you got 4 out of 6 favorable outcomes instead of only 2. Luckily, this card was quickly removed from the format after being playable at 1 for only a couple of months, but it still made a whole Dragon Ruler format way more miserable than it had any right to be in 2013. Despite being both a gamble card and a trap card, 6 Cents effect is so powerful it cannot ever be listed off the list, as there's no shortage of decks that would love a card that can be either a better Pot of Greed or Needlebug Nest most of the time. Out of all the payoffs for a good dice roll we've seen so far, none get even close to this card's potential of making you go +5. For being the strongest gamble card, and the only one which will never get unbanned, it easily makes the first spot on this list. The game of Yu-Gi-Oh! Is full of binaries. You can build boards or break them, tailor your strategy for aggro or control, attack or defend, binary sorceress. There's also the coin flip binary. But an interesting happens with coin cards in Yu-Gi-Oh! Sometimes they're not so heads or tails, and in this list we'll be running down the jankiest, most unpredictable cards that flip coins. And at number 10 on this list, we have Lucky Punch. This is a continuous trap card which flips 3 coins on an opponent's attack declaration once per turn. 3 heads and you draw 3 cards. 3 tails and Lucky Punch destroys itself and you take 6,000 damage. Actually, if you activate this card, you're probably taking the 6,000 damage anyway, because that's what happens if it's destroyed for any other reason as well. You might be able to circumvent that damage by banishing it first to dodge destruction with a card like Cosmic Cyclone, but also just why would you play this card at all? Obviously, no one really has in the competitive scene, but they don't have what this list does. Tunnel vision for the big wins and single-minded determination to ignore every unwanted outcome. This card lets you draw 3 cards and keep flipping. You could even draw 3 more cards after you've already drawn 3 cards and keep getting even more, as long as you keep flipping those heads. But what are the odds here actually? Okay, when you flip 3 coins, there are 8 possible outcomes, one of which is 3 heads, one of which is 3 tails. On every Lucky Punch resolution, you've got a 12.5% chance of scoring a deep draw and a 12.5% chance of losing 3/4 of your starting life points. That 25% chance of something happening is in a sweet low spot where it's often just low enough to lull your opponent into attacking through Lucky Punch, and then receiving a shock when 3 coins land in unison. Hopefully, they're all heads. The card art for Lucky Punch really sells its unpredictability, since it depicts the cute and cuddly rescue rabbit absolutely clobbering Behemoth, the king of all animals. Despite Behemoth's menacing visage, there are actually quite a few cards that show it getting owned by smaller creatures. There's even some chronology here with Duck Dummy, Underdog, and the Big Cattle Drive showing the aftermath of Behemoth's tragic bouts with Rescue Rabbit, Super Nimble Mega Hamster, and Desk Kangaroo. It's probably a good thing that most Yu-Gi-Oh! Players are too cowardly to run a full playset of Lucky Punch, because the card has only been released once as a short print in 2012's Return of the Duelist set. As dynamic as an activation of Lucky Punch can be, on 75% of its resolution, it's going to do nothing. And worse, it's just sitting there waiting to get popped. For that reason, it won't punch higher than the spot number 10. But it absolutely deserves a mention for its unpredictable critical effects. And shuffling the Mortal Coil at number 9 on this list is Arcana Force 13, Death. Oh no, wait a minute, Tour of Doom. While this continuous trap isn't officially part of the Arcana Force archetype, it was used by Arcana Force duelist Satoru Kumar in the yugioh anime, and released in 2008's Light of Destruction set alongside the other Arcana Force core support cards. Continuous traps aren't the fastest or most versatile cards, but since Tour of Doom can only resolve during your opponent's standby phase, It's one of those continuous traps that wouldn't be better if it could activate instantly. But what will Tour of Doom force your opponent to do? Well, it's more about what your opponent won't be doing. But first, you flip a coin. On heads, your opponent can enter normal or flip summon this turn. That can shut down a large amount of decks outright. So what happens on tails? If you guess the same exact limitations are placed on you next turn, you might be also a Master of Destiny and should start building your Arcana Force deck instantly, since the entire Arcana Force archetype is built around coin flips that decide between beneficial and harmful effects. They've also got support cards like Reversal of Fate and Light Barrier that help manipulate the odds of receiving a desirable result in your favor. Unfortunately, because Tour of Doom is not a monster, it won't benefit from these. Generic coin support like second coin toss can still help you out, but less consistency is less consistency. And here, that means increasing the risk of losing your normal summon, which can be devastating. A floodgate barring normal summons could be strong now, over 15 years since Light of Destruction and Tour of Doom's release, but in 2008, the inconsistency of the coin flip probably both saved the meta from Tour of Doom and made the card unpredictable enough to land on this list. As long as Tour of Doom is feasible on the field, the balance of the game is going to lurch wildly in one direction. And chances are, as good as not, the direction will 180 with every fresh resolution. While Tour of Doom was way too unpredictable to see competitive play in the TCG, in Duel Links people don't play it because it's currently unobtainable. It does, however, exist in the game. During Consumed by Light Sartorius Emerges, the Sartorius Kumar unlock event that debuted in March of 2019 and ran again in July, duelists unlucky enough to see the level 6 boss version of Sartorius Kumar activate Tour of Doom were probably cooked. Only Sartorius Kumar's big boss ran a copy of this card, but that was enough because he also had access to the event-exclusive Predestination skill that made all flipped coins land on heads. It's one of the harder NPC bosses to step up in a format full of pretty pathetic PvE duel encounters that players must grind to acquire the gems to compensate for the steep cost of opening packs. Tour of Doom had one appearance in the Yugioh GX anime, but it was a big one. In episode 170, Sartorius Kumar activated the card to kick off his second duel against Jaden Yuki. By using the anime-exclusive trap Decisive Power of Absolute Destiny, Sartorius was able to declare the name of a monster, and if Jaden had it in his deck, it is special summoned to the field in attack position. Since Sartorius cheated by slipping a copy of Arcana Force Zero the Fool into Jaden's deck before the start of the duel, he was able to call it to Jaden's field and use its destiny manipulating effect to correct any Tails flip from Tour of Doom, effectively stopping Jaden from ever having a normal summon. In episode 171, Jaden is able to bounce back by destroying his own Miracle Flipper with Hero Blast, which removes Sartorius' fix on the coin flip. As a result, a coin flipped Tails, causing Tour of Doom to turn on Sartorius Kumar, and he goes on to lose the duel. Are you an Arcana Force fiend? Can't get enough of Kumar? Are you Sartoriously a big fan of the Worldlock OTK? Good news, the number 8 pick for this list is another Arcana Force card, the Yugioh incarnation of the 18th piece of the Terra deck. There's a Mystical Moon Rising, and it's not an equip spell. It's the level 7 Light Fairy with 2800 attack and defense, Arcana Force 18, the Moon. Like all the Arcana Force monsters, the Moon has 2 effects. Technically 3 if you count the coin flip to determine whether it resolves its heads or tails effect. Let's start unraveling what exactly is going on here, because it's quite convoluted. On heads, the Moon will start summoning a Moon token during each of your standby phases, which is nice and simple. You can do a ton of things with the token. Link it off into a Link Karibo or something, unless you're playing a TCG format where it's banned as of April 2022. Where the Moon makes things silly is with its tails effect, where during each of your end phases, you must select one of your monsters to give to your opponent. It's worth noting that the Moon's coin-chosen effect persists even as control changes, meaning a Tails Moon can result in you and your opponent trading the Moon back and forth during each of the end phases. Combined with floodgates like Mask of Restrict and Vanity's Fiend, and you might not be closer to winning, but you have achieved a completely ridiculous game state in which no one's monster belongs to anyone for long, and the field is full of mass defections, leading to some Yu-Gi-Oh! Specific validation to folklore belief that people are made to act a little strange during a full moon. While no one has ever lived the dream of running the Moon to any effect in the TCG, this bizarre creature from beyond the stars did see the barest iota of competitive viability in Duel Links. This did not last long, as the deck it found a place in was a short-lived Duel Links iteration of Nurse Burn, a strategy that revolves around summoning Dark Lord Nurse Rafikil to redirect life point increases into decreases. Since Dark Lord Nurse Rafikil arrived in Duel Links in the same window as the Passive Destiny, players were able to create a viable OTK deck using Sartorius Kumar's Master of Destiny skill, which turned their first 3 coin flips into guaranteed heads as long as there are 7 or more different cards in the main deck that flip coins. The idea was to draw enough cards using Into the Void, Cup of Ace, Cards in the Sky, and Pot of Duality that you could normal summon Dark Lord Norse Refugial, set up a few passive Destiny, and end your turn. Confident that your opponent's next standby phase would spell the end of the duel, as you would burn them all the way to the ground. Unfortunately, the Moon didn't serve any real role in the deck beyond an obligatory coin toss card to put you one closer to the skill floor of 7, and just being banished fodder for cards from the sky. The Moon was likely chosen over other Arcana Force cards on vibes. It's a very goofy card that you probably wouldn't use for any other real reason, which makes it an attractive inclusion in this gimmicky deck. Sadly, the Moon's brief time in the sun drew to a swift close to the new ban list in May 23rd of 2024. That limited the passive Destiny to 1 and banned Dark Lord Nurse Refugial outright. Arcana Force 18 the Moon actually had one on-field appearance in the Yu-Gi-Oh! GX anime. Again, it was used by Sartorius Kumar, but this time against Aster Phoenix in episode 100. A duel Sartorius would actually win, despite his questionable choice to play the Moon. Together with the token summoned by its heads effect, Sartorius was able to fill the full tribute cost for Arcana Force 21, the World, a monster way better than the Moon could ever hope to be. Although Aster Phoenix is eventually able to absorb the World with its Destiny Hero Plasma, Sartorius is able to finish his match with his ace monster, Arcana Force EX, the Light Ruler. I guess Aster Phoenix should remember to attack the Moon before Kumar could sacrifice it. Ultimately, while the Moon would prove too unpredictable for almost any use, this is precisely what makes it fit for this list, even if it'll rest on the lower end. Ushering in an age of caprice and topsy-turvy vagary is this list number 7 pick, Goddess of Whim. This level 3 light fairy has vines for hair, which is fitting because its effect can cause its base attack of 950 to grow and grow. Once per turn, the Goddess of Whim can cast a coin. On heads, her attack is doubled until the end of the turn. On tails, her attack is halved, which is less fun, but worth mentioning because there's a 50% chance that's going to happen instead, for such is the nature of Goddess of Whim. Her power is great, but unreliable. She probably got her clothes from the Tailor of the Fickle. And the fickleness of Goddess Whims goes on, because if you want to purchase a playset as of writing of this video, her cost can be as low as 78 cents for 3, or up to $18.15. This is because Goddess of Whim originally released late in 2002 as a super rare in the special promotional booster pack distributed by McDonald's inside Happy Meals, along with one of 3 different CDs that contained music to duel by. Other notable cards that released with Goddess of Whim were Cosmo Queen and Millennium Shield, both of which saw wider circulation alongside other McDonald promo cards in the Legendary Collection 3 Yugi's World Mega Pack in 2012. Goddess of Whim actually saw its first reprint in 2011's Gold Series 4 Pyramid Edition. Fellow McDonald's promo card Millennium Shield was the only one to release with Goddess of Whim in this set. So, what makes Goddess of Whim unpredictable enough to land this list? It comes down to one missing word: original. While Goddess of Whim isn't going to be shattering any metas, it's an interesting example of a true doubling effect. To compare, let's take a look at Karate Man. It's a level 3 Earth Warrior with 1000 attack and defense, plus the effect to double its original attack once per turn. This basically makes Karate Man a 2000 attack normal summon that destroys itself during the end phase of the turn that it activates its effect. Now, let's equip Karate Man with the Black Pendant, bringing its attack up to 2500. Sweet. Now, let's do science and try this same thing with the Goddess of Whim. On a successful activation of her effect, Goddess of Whim's 950 attack will double into a considerable 1900. But add a Black Pendant and she'll actually surpass a Karate Man equipped with the same, landing at a crushing 2900. This is because Karate Man's original attack is doubled before adding Black Pendant's bonus. Meanwhile, Goddess of Whim absorbs the power Black Pendant before doubling her strength, leading the equipped spell to favor her with an extra 500 attack. True doubling can grow your monster's stat lines wildly, and as a result, Konami has printed more cards that double original stats than cards that engage in a true doubling. Cashing in for a prize spot at number 6 is the normal trap from 2013's Shadow Spectre set, Big Win. When this card is activated, you'll first declare a level between 1 and 12. Then both players will toss a coin. On double heads, all face-up monsters you control at activation will become the declared level. Roll double tails and you'll be paying life points to the tune of 500 times the level you chose. A result of mismatched heads and tails fizzles the card and is probably where the question mark of the name comes in. The main reason you'd gamble on a successful resolution of Big Win is it can prep almost any board for high level, high overlay XC summons. Want to summon number 77, the 7 Sins, the hard way, so you can activate its effect on the same turn to non-target banish every special summon monster your opponent controls? Just get 2 bodies on board, declare level 12, flip a Big Win, and don't lose. Because if you do, 500 times 12 is 6000 damage, and that's some major youch. Want to pull the flex of all flexes and summon Divine Arsenal AA Zeus Sky Thunder during main phase 1 of turn 2? Big Win can do it. Ra Have Mercy, you can do it. With a full board of monsters with varying levels, you can use Big Win to fill your opponent with Cold Fear, where you dare to insta-summon a full-powered 5-material Melfi Mommy. Use Big Win to summon Leviathan, a Gene Raider Boss of Shadows, with 6 materials, and use its effect to bring out a surprise 6,000 attack Jormungandr at an opportune time. Coins permitting, you can pull off some Wild Xyz jank with Big Win, but that's not all that's cool about this card. Let's take a look at the art. Big Win shows 2 players revealing their hands in a round of 5-card draw poker. The player who appears to be the dealer is unbothered by his adversary's field of whites as he casually flips his final card. The 4 that have already been revealed are the legs and arms of Exodia, and one assumes that per the rules of 5-card draw and Yu-Gi-Oh! Both, if he reveals Exodia the Forbidden One, the hand will be his. His opponent has a mighty board of gold, but appears to be pushing it all in and betting the dealer will reveal anything but Exodia. After all, per the rules of Yu-Gi-Oh! Poker, a hand of 4 whites must surely beat almost everything, especially if the seemingly mismatched 5th spell card is in fact tri-white. What's interesting about the Exodia pieces depicted is that they display the OCG art that was censored internationally for its incorporation of a pentagram. Was this an intentional fun nod to the original art, or did this fly under the censorship radar? Big Win is full of questions, literally, which makes it an easy add to this unpredictable list. Firing up to take number 5 on this list is Gatling Dragon. The level 8 Dark Machine fusion of Blowback Dragon and Barrel Dragon with 2600 attack and 1200 defense. Originally released in 2005's Flaming Eternity, Gatling Dragon instantly saw competitive play despite its coin card status. And although the meta has progressed to new fused Dark Machines far beyond Gatling Dragon's power level, the original coin-flipping, board-clearing machine easily takes a spot on this list and continues to occupy an important niche and GOAT format. It's effect time, and what happens when Gatling Dragon activates involves 3 coins and destroying as many monsters as you flip heads. With the ability to pop any number from none to 3 monsters once per turn, Gatling Dragon is a difficult threat to anticipate. It doesn't target, which limits the responses an opponent might prepare for the card, but also your own, because the real unpredictability of Gatling Dragon is that it blows up cards regardless of who controls them. If your opponent only controls 1 monster, but it's a high level one with more attack than you can handle, you might use Metamorphosis on your Trihorn Dragon to deploy Gatling Dragon, which is more than capable of clearing away their big beat sticks. But let's say you flip 3 heads. Great, your opponent's monster is blown away, but Gatling Dragon's destruction is mandatory, and if you can't find 2 more monsters on your opponent's board, you'll have to make up the difference by offering up your own. Gatling Dragon is often a potential target for Gatling Dragon, making this a dangerously unpredictable card. Of course, sometimes the situation calls for a little danger, and that's why Gatling Dragon sees play. Any Uno fan will tell you, nothing gets you out of a jam like a wild card. Let's circle back to Metamorphosis, because it's a card that's commonly paired with Gatling Dragon. Banned in the TCG for the ease in which it can cheat out fusion monsters of any level while avoiding any self-balancing through and hindering restrictions, Metamorphosis is a staple within GOAT format. This popular version of time-locked Yu-Gi-Oh! Was frozen in the summer of 2005, and the name comes from Scapegoat, a pivotal card from this important snapshot of the meta. With less overpowered fusion monsters to make Metamorphosis busted, the card is playable, and Gatling Dragon is your go-to level 8 extra deck cheat. Sure, it can blow back on you sometimes, but desperate times call for desperate solutions. And Gatling Dragon is just unpredictable enough to turn some tables with the right amount of heads. And at number 4, we're shaking things up with Elemental Hero Chaos Neos, a level 9 Dark Warrior contact fusion with the popular premium stat line of 3000 attack and 2500 defense. Originally released in 2007 set's Gladiator Assault, Chaos Neos is one of those fusion monsters that doesn't use polymerization. Instead, like the rest of the Neospatian fusion monsters, it's called from the extra deck by shuffling its materials from the field back into the deck. While many of the Neospatian fusions are simple 2-body contacts, like the way Elemental Hero Dark Neos can be summoned by shuffling Elemental Hero Neos and Neospatian Dark Panther, there are also stronger, more complicated contact fusions like Elemental Hero Magma Neos that require 3 or more materials. Chaos Neos is one of those more advanced contact fusions, requiring the core Elemental Hero Neos and its fellow Neospatian Dark Panther and Neospatian Glowmoss. With Magma Neos, we can understand how Magma results from a Fire and Earth monster, and it also makes sense that a combination of Dark and Light yields Chaos. Above that, Dark Panther and Glowmoss carry effects that are kind of chaotic, with Dark Panther able to copy names and effects of other monsters, and Glowmoss able to activate a different effect every time it's the target of an attack, determined by the category of a card drawn by your opponent. Chaos Neos makes its chaotic materials proud by flipping 3 coins once per turn during your main phase 1 and activating a different effect for every number of heads. On 3, you can destroy every monster your opponent controls, which is pretty epic. On 2, the effects of your opponent's monsters are negated, which can sometimes be even better than outright destroying them. On 1, things start to turn around, however, and literally because Chaos Neos will bounce all of your monsters to your hand, including itself. On 0, nothing happens, which is itself a relief, because 1 heads was bad enough. Basically, whatever Elemental Hero Neos Chaos does, it's going to be huge, unless it's nothing, so you'll just have to keep on your toes. During the end phase, like many contact fusions, Chaos Neos will shuffle itself back into the deck, but while some other Neospatian fusions will finish their effects there, Chaos Neos will go on to set all face-up monsters on the field face down when it leaves the field by its own effect. Elemental Hero Chaos Neos has 1 anime appearance, and it's a fittingly wild one. During episode 130 of the GX anime, Jaden Yuki contact fuses Chaos Neos during his tag duel with Jesse Anderson against Marcel Bonaparte, who was possessed by the spirit of Yubel. Elemental Hero Chaos Neos was able to attack and destroy Marcel's Ura, Lord of Syrian Flames, through the effects of Haman, Lord of Striking Thunder, since it had been neutralized by Chaos Neos' second effect. Although the result of the duel would be inconclusive, Chaos Neos helped Jaden and Jesse hold on long enough for Jaden to slip through the rift between worlds that opened the vortex of energy spawned by the clash of Jesse's Rainbow Dragon and Yubel's Armatile the Chaos Phantasm. The end of the encounter would haunt Jaden, who felt immense guilt over the unknown fate of Jesse Anderson. In the way, the advent of Elemental Hero Chaos Neos was an important crux in the GX anime, defining much of the direction where this series would continue on from there. If you haven't seen Menko Mori, the level 1 Earthwing beast with no attack and defense that's number 3 on this list, don't worry. It probably hasn't seen you, because it's a bat that means notoriously bad eyesight. Of course, some bats have good eyesight, but often specimens of the Sherpatera order with flat noses rely on specialized echolocation to hunt insects, and Menko Mori has a flat nose. You and Menko Mori might have also not seen each other, because this little coin-flipping bat has yet to be released in the TCG, and only debuted in Japan at the end of April of 2024. Menko Mori has 2 main effects, one of which can activate 3 times in a turn, and one that can only resolve once per turn. When a face-up monsters flip face down, or a set monsters flip face up, Menko Mori can target one of those monsters once per turn, and change it to the opposite position. Its 3 times effect also involves the setting and flipping of monsters. When your opponent summons outside the damage step, you can flip a coin. On heads, the monsters change to face-up attack mode, and on tails, face-down defense mode, meaning its repeating coin effect can trigger the once per turn one. If that all sounds confusing, don't worry. It is, and that's why Menko Mori is so high on this list. Whether you want heads or tails on your flips is situational. Whether you're using Menko Mori to flip your opponent's monsters or your own is also situational, and the situation surrounding Menko Mori is always going to be unpredictable. While Menko Mori hasn't had the chance to impact the TCG yet, there are a few synergies worth investigating. For one, Menko Mori could be an important component to Empty Jar OTK, a strategy revolving around using your limited copies of Cyber Jar and Morphing Jar to mill your opponent into decking out. Cards like Book of Moon, Book of Taiyu, Book of Eclipse, and now potentially Menko Mori could help you achieve this by flipping and unflipping your jars. It also might find a home in ninja decks that rely on flipping cards as well. And at number 2, we have Scion the Valence Archer, a level 4 water spellcaster pendulum monster with 1100 attack and defense. Releasing in 2022's Tactical Master set, the Valence archetype is a bizarre one, and requires a certain level of tactical mastery to effectively play. It's understandable that many may not be totally familiar with Scion the Valence Archer, as a common and unfortunate response to watching your opponent open Valence is to scoop, but this is kind of the unpredictableness on which this list thrives. So let's get into it. We'll start with the Valence playstyle as a whole before analyzing Scion alone. And the field spells are a great place to begin. Valence World, Shinra Bansho, and Valence World, Koin Gwisen are the 2 field spells, and when one is activated, the other is placed to your opponent's field zone. While not unheard of outside of this line of cards, there aren't many cards in Yu-Gi-Oh! That activate your field spell to your opponent's board. So what's the deal with that? Well, the Valence are a game, literally. Their inspirations are tabletop games, maybe Warhammer 40k. By playing the 2 field spells, you have set the board and created 2 bases, one for the feudal-style Japanese warriors and one for the robo-mechs. Both cards give a crucial ability to the turn player. Once per turn, Shinra Bansho lets you special summon a monster from the spell and trap card zone to a monster zone in the same column. Koin Gwisen lets you target an opponent's effect monster and shift it back into the corresponding spell and trap card zone, but only if you control a monster in the same column. Both effects can only be activated when there are cards in both field zones. So, With these two spells, the Valence creates a game within the game, where enemy monsters can be removed by pushing them to retreat into the spell and trap card zone. There, they can be returned to the hand by the effect of Valence Genesis Grand Duke, which inflicts damage to your opponent equal to the monster's attack, and also gains attack equal to half the damage. Genesis Grand Duke can be fused from two Valence monsters, but is more often special summoned from the extra deck by its own effect, since that way it only requires one tribute of a level 5 or higher non-fusion Valence monster in the same column as an extra monster zone. Okay, now that we've given the unique Valence playstyle a very broad overview, what's up with our favorite mech outmaneuvering archer, Seon? Like other low-level Valence main deck monsters, it has the shared pendulum effect to special summon itself to the monster zone in its same column, at the cost of locking out a special summoning non-Valent cards, except from the extra deck for the rest of the turn. This is the reverse of what we often see, which is main deck monsters limiting access to the extra deck in some way. Seon's monster effect is where the coin starts flipping. You can target one effect monster on the field and flip a coin. Heads, you negate its effect. Tails, you have its attack. Importantly, you can only activate Seon's effect if it was special summoned, meaning you'll probably be bringing him out from the pendulum zone with its own effect, rather than giving him your normal summon. This is a pretty good coin flip effect with two outcomes and no downsides, but it's not really unpredictable. So why is Seon on this list? Well, there's more text on the card, obviously. We're not done flipping coins, and we're certainly not done playing the mad game of Valence. If Seon is moved from one monster zone to another, he can target a card in the field and flip another coin. Heads, Seon destroys the card. Tails, and Seon bounces it back to the hand. Seon is a coin-flipping quadruple threat capable of removing monsters from your opponent in many ways, from literally many different directions. A true tactical master. Many Valence cards carry effects that allow them to rearrange the position of monsters on board, which is useful since after specialing Seon from the pendulum zone, you'll want to clear that space so you can move in another Valence monster. Also, most Valence players are going to be running copies of Senate Switch, a continuous spell that was totally useless for many years, but has now found another niche. You can also use Seon's other bounce effects to recover and reactivate a Senate Switch, so you can continue adjusting your board on the same turn. The Valence archetype takes the game of Yu-Gi-Oh! And makes it something different, and is inherently difficult to predict because the rules of Valence play by are not ones you'll be learning by any other ways than playing as or against the Valence. Among this hotbed of unprediction, Seon is a rogue element, and a sure shot for this list number 2. Origami Goddess is a level 1 Dark Fairy with a deceptively low base 100 attack and base nothing defense, and it's the true deity of unpredictable coin cards. It was released in late 2023 with Age of Overlord and has no power ceiling. Really. Origami Goddess is as good as you are lucky with no upper limit, and for that reason, easily takes the number 1 spot on this list. Against Origami Goddess, any competition folds. Origami Goddess has 2 effects, and both of them are wild enough on their own to justify a top 10 list appearance at some point somewhere. But together, don't let her chilled demeanor fool you. This paper goddess can cut. Maybe not at first with just 100 attack, but for every coin that lands heads while this card is on the field, Origami Goddess's attack doubles. This can very quickly get out of hand, especially when Origami Goddess activates its first effect, which is that once per turn, you can flip coins consecutively until you land on tails, and then draw 1 card for every 2 heads results. Let's do some quick math. All Yu-Gi-Oh! Players love to do math. It is our cursed fate to tinker with numbers. How many heads must Origami Goddess see before she's strong enough to bop your opponent for game when they're at full life points? The answer is 7 heads, which will end with your Origami Goddess climbing to a devastating 12,800 attack. So how hard is it to bless your Origami Goddess with 7 heads? Well, although it's never a sure thing, because these are coin flip cards after all, doing this is easier than it would first appear. Achieving your 7 heads on 1 activation of Origami Goddess probably isn't happening, since you're looking at a 0.8% chance of getting it, and those odds simply won't go over even. But critically, while the effect of Origami Goddess can only be activated once while she's face up, doing so does not lock you out of summoning and activating more Origami Goddesses. If you're mad or epic enough to go for an Origami Goddess OTK, cards like Halactrice, Valhalla, Hall of the Fallen, 1 for 1, and Where Art Thou can help you search and summon your pantheon of Origami Gods, while thinning your deck to get the best value from the draws you'll hopefully score from their effects. Second coin toss is also going to be huge here, as that gives you a free redo during your Origami coin blazes, and will generally boost your quantity of heads. We'll call that a head count. The idea here is to get as many Origami Goddesses on field as possible, and supplement your baseline coin boost with cards like Cup of Ace and Couple of Aces to just further juice your stats while facilitating further plays. Earlier, we covered that you need 7 coin flips to break the 8,000 attack barrier. But why stop there? With 3 more heads, you can bring things up to 102,400. With a few more, you'll break 1,000,000. Yep, 14 heads, and your Origami Goddess will sit at 1,638,400 attack, ready to pour the wrath of the Origami Gods onto all that might stand against them. When you're flipping a coin, it's going to land on heads or tails. Origami Goddess takes that simplicity and denies it. No one can say for certain how astronomically high her attack can rise, nor what cards you might want to draw with her effect. Because of the absurd degree of her power scaling, it'd be unwise to put her any lower than the top, lest her unpredictable ire be roused. A critical component to any game is chance. This is obvious when coins are flipped and dice are thrown, but chance in Yu-Gi-Oh! Runs much deeper than that. Is the meta skewed enough that an anti-meta deck has a shot at winning? Should you commit all of your resources to go for game, or hold back to save some gas to outplay your opponent on the next turn? No coins are involved, but there are still gambles, and these cards are too. And raging forward to kick this list off at the number 10 spot is the quick play spell Berserker Soul. Since this card can only be played when your monster inflicts 1,500 or less damage in a direct attack, and requires you to discard your entire hand to activate, just running this card is already a huge risk. Let's check out the payoff. After you've thrown down your Berserker Soul Gauntlet, you'll excavate the top card of your deck. And if it's a monster, it's sent to the graveyard and your opponent takes 500 points of damage. Then you do it again and again, up to 7 more times. Here's the gamble. If you excavate a spell or trap, Berserker Soul finishes out without any further excavations or burns. When you activate Berserker Soul, you're wagering that at least your next few cards will be monsters. If your next 8 draws do not include a spell or trap, Berserker Soul will mill 8 and inflict 4,000 points of damage. This is an incredible effect that could easily swing any duel, but that's why it's so hard to pull off. Unsurprising for a card that's extremely difficult and costly to activate for potentially no upside, Berserker Soul has seen exactly no competitive placements in the TCG since its release in 2014's Dragon of Legends set. What makes Berserker Soul worthy of note beyond its desperate and finicky effect is its high-profile appearance in the Waking the Dragon's arc in the original Duel Monsters anime. In episode 162, Yamayugi faces off against the longtime C-tier rival, Weevil Underwood. Unfortunately, Weevil's deck received a huge buff from Weevil committing his soul to darts and the Seal of the Orichalcos, trading ownership of his soul for the power to maybe get back at the King of Games for defeating him over 150 episodes ago. Also, Weevil challenged Yugi to a duel on the top of a runaway train, which made for a pretty epic bout, but wow, was this arc literally off the rails. Even with the Pharaoh at the time the most vulnerable he's ever been, the spirit of Yugi having been siphoned by the Great Leviathan following his loss to Raphael, and the legendary dragon Timaeus angry with him for causing that outcome by playing the soul-stealing field spell, Yamayugi was still able to put an intense back and forth against the empowered Weevil. Then things got a little heated. Weevil held up a Gogi Bori card, but kept the front hidden from the Pharaoh. With sadistic pleasure, the insect duelist claimed that the soul of Yugimoto had been locked away in the card that he held, the one that he then ripped in half and scattered to the whipping train wind while the Pharaoh watched in horror. Unsurprisingly, this turned out to be a critical misplay. Or did it? Let's dig in. Enraged, Yamayugi activates Berserker Soul and has his Breaker the Magical Warrior slash into Weevil 7 consecutive times. Weevil's life points had long since dropped to 0, but the Pharaoh continued excavating and slashing for no other reason than to make Weevil suffer. He only stopped and let the duel finally terminate at the behest of Taya Gardner, who found his Dark Shift alarming. Yugi also realized that the 8th card he drew but never weaponized was the Dark Magician Girl, who was symbolic of the hope that the Pharaoh would save the world. Obviously, Berserker Soul didn't turn out well for Weevil, but it did play into the overall strategy of darts against the Pharaoh, which was to force him to realize and embrace his own evil nature. Raphael was successful in his regard by convincing the Pharaoh to activate the Seal of Orichalcos, and Weevil was too in his own way. Yugimoto has always been a positive influence on the Pharaoh, calling him back from the ruthless decisions the spirit of the puzzle would later regret, like knocking Seto Kaiba off the ramparts of the Castle Pegasus. While Berserker Soul can claim a pivotal moment in the Duel Monsters anime, the actual card that released a decade after the rematch between the Pharaoh and Weevil Underwood was very bad. So bad that it can only take the bottom spot of this list. Don't be like the Pharaoh, don't take this gamble, you'll make Taya sad and probably lose the duel anyway. And the card we're drafting for the number 9 spot on this list is Conscription, a normal trap that was released in 2005 as part of the Cybernetic Revolution set. On activation, Conscription has your opponent excavate the top card of their deck. If they pull a monster that could be normal summoned or set, you can special summon it to your field. If they pull anything else, the card stays in their hand. No coins are flipped, but when you activate Conscription, one of two things will happen. You'll either get a free body on your board, or let your opponent go +2 in card advantage. The riskiness of conscription is also enhanced by excavating from your opponent's deck. Since you have no control of the cards your opponent chooses, you can't tilt the odds in your favor by stacking your own deck. Building your deck around Berserker Soul is almost always going to be a losing strategy, but at least you can do it. Conscription will always be a shot in the dark, hoping that your opponent's running a lot of normal summons. This inherent uncertainty is surely the reason Conscription has seen 0 competitive placements despite being in circulation for almost 20 years. But in the early days of Duel Links, Conscription did see experimentation. Available from the start in the Ultimate Rising main block, Conscription was a useful tool in early mill decks. These decks mostly revolved around using Assault on GHQ to take cards off the top of your opponent's deck. By running Jowls of Dark Demise to take control of enemy monsters, you could sack your opponent's cards as cost to resolve Assault on GHQ, with Warm Worm being another option to destroy for even more mill. Because Assault on GHQ needed bodies, and because the sting of giving your opponent a free draw was softened by getting them one card closer to decking out, Conscription saw some play as a risky stall with potential high payoff. Usage of Conscription dropped over time as better options entered the game, but it still had its moments. It also had its moments in 2013's Battle Pack 2, War of the Giants. This product was intended for use in sealed play, where duelists will be deck building with the packs they pull and duel on the spot. While it wouldn't be the cornerstone to anyone's strategy, in that format you use what you pull, and a desperate Conscription activation can turn a tough spot around, even if it might bury you instead. And what's the number 8 pick of this list? The answer to that question is Question. It's a normal spell that forces your opponent into a guessing game. Once the card is played, your opponent can no longer check your graveyard. This is relevant because they must now guess the final monster from the bottom of your graveyard. If your opponent is an omniscient Quizlord and calls correctly, that monster is banished. If they get it wrong, you can special summon it. This might sound pretty easy, as all they do is remember, right? But with the speed of modern Yu-Gi-Oh play, it's entirely conceivable and even likely for your opponent to flub their guess. Add to that the many cards that banish or shuffle from grave, and the difficulty the question posed can be extreme. This card is an oldie from 2003's Pharaonic Guardian, but despite this, it has never seen competitive play. It's hard to justify running Question when both Monster Reborn and Call the Haunted came out in 2002. Still, Question's game show design inspiration and unique chance mechanic make this card an interesting piece of niche Yu-Gi-Oh! Question actually has a few anime appearances, including one high-profile use in Joey Wheeler's duel against Yami Merrick in the Battle City semifinals. After a long and grueling shadow game, Joey Wheeler activated Question, forcing Yami Merrick to guess the bottom card in his grave. Merrick, whose strategy revolved around using sadistic cards like Coffin Seller, Drolego, and Helbamir, was too focused on inflicting suffering on Joey's soul and failed to anticipate the importance of Joey's bond with his monsters. Since Helbamir's graveyard effect caused Joey to discard from hand, Yami Merrick had no way of guessing that Jinzo was Joey's revival target. Even though Joey would end up losing the duel once Merrick's relentless torture left him unable to stand, the activation of Question was a huge victory for Joey, who proved to himself and everyone watching that although Yami Merrick was indeed powerful, his arrogant sadism was also a huge vulnerability. In the end, Question might be only the number 8 pick for this list, but remember this dude and his mustache because there's no question about it, he'll be showing up later. First releasing as a secret rare in the 2012 Premium Collection 10, Ma'at is the number 7 pick for this list, and also the number of Millennium items depicted in this card's art. Honestly, you could argue only 6 are actually shown, but for the sake of symmetry on this list, we're sticking with the line that the Eye of Widget on Mahat's forehead is the Millennium Eye. Millennium items have deep ties to games of chance, since one of their central powers is to enable the holder to force shadow games on opponents. These shadow games exact a terrible cost on the loser, and do not always take the form of duel monsters, as seen in episode 39 of the Duel Monsters anime when Yami Bakura and Maximilian Pegasus engage in a reality-distorting laser light show. But actually making use of its 7 Millennium items is not what earns Ma'at number 7. Let's look at its gambling effect. When Ma'at hits the field, its base question mark attack and defense starts at 0, which might seem low for a level 10 light fairy that can only be summoned from your hand by sending a light dragon and a light fairy control to the grave. It won't stay that way. Once per turn, you can activate Ma'atat's effect by declaring 3 card names. After that, you excavate the top 3 cards of your deck, and any cards that match your declarations are added to your hand, with Ma'atat's attack shifting to equal to the number of cards that went to your hand times 1000. The other cards fall to the graveyard, making the worst outcome of Ma'atat's effect a simple mill 3, which can still be useful in decks that favor a robust grave. The best Ma'atat outcome is pretty hard to beat. Basically, drawing 3 for no penalty is fantastic. Card Demise is currently limited to 1 in the TCG for being able to provide the same effect, but with a whole bunch of extra restrictions. So why hasn't Ma'at seen much in the way of competitive play? Well, sending 2 specific types of monsters from your field to the grave isn't an insurmountable cost, but it is steep. And unless you're running cards to stack your deck like Card Advance or Absolute King Backjack, you can't count a Ma'at breaking even in card advantage. And with its stat line reliant on the success of its effect, Ma'at becomes even more difficult as a card to utilize effectively. There have been more reliable ways to ready a 3000 attack beat stick since the game began. Despite its 7 visual references to the Duel Monsters anime, Ma'at never appeared on screen, probably because wielding every Millennium item would bestow with a power far exceeding the text printed on the card. Ma'at does have 1 appearance in the yugioh manga, however, with Jade and Yuki summoning it in Chapter 64 to secure a win for himself and Chaz Princeton in their tag duel against Tragodia. Interestingly, in this iteration, Ma'at was a fusion of Jaden's Wing Karibo and Chaz's Light Darkness Dragon. So, while the TCG version of Ma'at lost its fusion status in translation, we can still see an echo of its GX manga appearance and its summoning cost. Getting set up to take the number 6 spot on this list is the normal spell Ante. This card has been around since 2003's Magician 4 set, but has seen no competitive play. And it's not hard to see why. Ante has both you and your opponent reveal a card from your hand. For the player with a higher level card, nothing happens. But the player who reveals the card with a lower level must discard it and take 1000 points of burn damage. Hand ripping your opponent while inflicting burn damage isn't a bad effect. However, giving your opponent the ability to choose which card from their hand is maybe sent to the graveyard can put you at a disadvantage. Some cards want to live in the graveyard, and Ante might be giving your opponent an easy way to move them there. If your opponent doesn't have any monsters in hand, you're in luck because spells and traps are treated as level 0, meaning any monster will win against them in an ante-off. While Ante's performance in the TCG has been pretty lackluster, its performance in Duel Links does not lackluster. In a format where life points start at 4000, burn damage is much more valuable. Above that, Duel Links starting hands are only 4 cards. An opening play of a successful Ante reduces your opponent's starting hand and life points by a quarter. Even when many Duel Links burn cards had their damage capabilities halved to scale their power down to intended levels, Ante escaped this reduction, sitting at its original 1000. This is probably because Ante has been de facto limited to 1 since its release in 2016, with that 1 copy only being available by leveling the Paradox Brothers all the way up to level 38. And that's a grind that might be worth it in Duel Links. Any deck that utilizes primarily high-level monsters can slot an Ante to cheesily finish close games. Some of these decks over the years have been Yubel, Xyz Trains, Time Lords, and also 3-star Demotion. A deck from early Duel Links that used the Paradox Brothers skill 3-star Demotion to normal summon strong level 7s like Suijin and Guardian Angel Joan without tributing. Persevering against the odds to claim number 5 on this list is the risky card Heart of the Underdog. This continuous spell released in 2004's Invasion of Chaos set, and has a very simple effect. When you top deck a normal monster during your draw phase, you can reveal it to draw another card. If that new draw is a normal monster, you can reveal it to draw another card ad infinitum. As long as you've got normals to draw, you can keep drawing. Here's the gamble. In order for Heart of the Underdog to realize value, you have to run enough normal monsters to justify it, which is a risk. If you fail to see Heart of the Underdog, or just have bad luck during the draw phase, all the heart in the world isn't going to save you from taking a major L. But the upside to Heart of the Underdog is potentially tremendous. Importantly, 4 out of 5 Exodia pieces are normal monsters, which makes Underdog Deep Draw Exodia a janky but workable win condition in GOAT format. And that's not even the only GOAT format deck that revolves around Heart of the Underdog. Just running lots of high attack normal monsters with strong backrow removal like Mirror Force in order to charge can catch some wins. Another Heart of the Underdog GOAT strat is the Spirit Ryu OTK. Spirit Ryu is a level 4 wind dragon with 1000 attack and defense, and a quick effect during the damage step discard a dragon monster to gain another 1000 attack and defense until the end of the battle phase. Critically, this effect is not once per turn, so you can activate it as many times as you have dragons to lose. Here's a quick equation to explain. Heart of the Underdog plus a deck full of normal dragons can equal a Spirit Ryu with a 10,000 attack going for a game. It's unreliable, but that's the point. It's got heart, and brave souls with the grit to pull it off might find themselves drawn upwards of 10 cards and swinging for incredible amounts of damage. In episode 185 of the Duel Monsters anime, Yugimoto gives Heart of the Underdog as a gift to a kid named Rick who had a real running only normal dragons and nothing else problem, telling Rick that the card reminded him of a dear friend. That dear friend was Joey Wheeler. He is the underdog. In episode 186, Yamayugi takes over for Rick in a duel against the Kaiba land computer gone haywire. The situation at first looks a bit bleak since Rick runs almost 0 good cards. But Heart of the Underdog let Yugi draw 5 normal dragons and Spirit Ryu, giving us a rare anime demonstration of an OTK. Still, there are other decks where you might find value by using Heart of the Underdog that don't revolve around an OTK, particularly pendulum archetypes that use lots of normal monsters like Metal Foes and Ignites. And turning the tables to take number 4 is the normal spell Reversal Quiz. Remember this guy and his magnificent mustache? Well, he's back and ready to answer more questions. To activate Reversal Quiz, you have to go all in, wagering all the cards from your hand and field and every life point you have. First, send everything. Hand, field, everything to the graveyard. Then declare a type of card, spell, trap, or monster, and then look at the top of your deck. If you got the call right, swap your life points with your opponents. If you're wrong, fizzle. Reversal Quiz released in 2003's Pharaonic Guardian set, and although it wouldn't see a large amount of competitive play, it was the key ingredient of a handful of placements it did receive. The big idea was to lower your life points as much as possible, and there are quite a few ways to do this. And then activate Reversal Quiz while copies of Black Pendant or Fuma Shuriken are on the field. If you can call the Reversal Quiz and foist your low life point value on your opponent while sending those equip spells to the grave as a cost, that can be game. After the resolution of Reversal Quiz, the graveyard effects of Black Pendant and Fuma Shuriken will activate, dealing 500 and 700 burn per, respectively. By bleeding enough life points before pulling out a Reversal Quiz, you can take your opponent's starting life points to game over in one activation. And at number 3 of this no coins, no dice, all gambles cards list is The True Name. Releasing in 2016's Millennium Pack, The True Name is a reference to the Spirit of Millennium puzzle from the original Duel Monsters anime, Pharaoh Atem. When Atem inhabited the puzzle, much of his memories were sealed away, including his name, which is why he'd frequently go by a moniker inspired by his vessel living as Yami or Dark Yugi. The Duel Monsters anime is at its core Yugimoto and Atem's journey to solve the puzzle of The True Name. And after the ceremonial duel between the two, Atem is able to recover his lost memories and pass into the afterlife. The effect of The True Name is also a reference to the powers of Atem, which include manipulations of destiny to manifest whatever card he may need in a given situation. If you're like the Pharaoh Atem and able to anticipate your next draw, you can activate The True Name and declare the card on top of your deck. If correct, you can add it to your hand and then fetch a divine monster from your deck to also add to your hand. Or special summon it to the field. A surprise Egyptian god card can be an intimidating sight for your opponent, but Ra and its other forms cannot be special summoned, and your other options, Slifer the Sky Dragon and Obs the Tormentor, share the effect that they must be sent to the graveyard during the end phase of the turn that they were special summoned. Because of this, you might just wind up adding to hand, but that also synergizes other cards like Egyptian God Slime, Soul Crossing, and Millennium Revelation that make getting out your gods a little easier. Slifer enjoyers might also use the True Name to cheat out Slifer precisely because it'll send itself to the grave, send up your grave for a massive activation of the Revived Sky God on your next turn. Although the True Name has only seen a meager amount of competitive plays, it's an important part of Divine Archetypes and a reference to the pivotal moment of the climax of the Duel Monsters anime. The number 2 spot on this list saw a wild amount of competitive play right out the gate after its 2016 release in the Dark Illusion set, and its relevance to the competitive scene has not diminished since. Pot of Desires is a normal spell and one of the many Pot of Greed rechains. It's actually a visual mix between Pot of Greed and Pot of Avarice, with the effect to draw 2 at the cost of banishing face down 10 cards from the top of your deck. There are other cards that let you pay a similarly steep cost to enjoy some cool extra draws, like Pot of Extravagance and Pot of Prosperity. So let's look at how these cards are different. Extravagance banishes face down 3 or 6 random cards from your extra deck to let you draw 1 for every 3 cards banished. Prosperity is similar, but you can choose which cards are banished face down, and instead of drawing, you'll activate the same number of cards and choose one to add to your hand. These are both gambles in their own way, but their costs can be mitigated within strategies that don't rely on their full extra deck. While most decks in Yu-Gi-Oh! Lean heavily on Synchro, Fusion, Xyz, and Link monsters, some archetypes like Toons, Flunderees, Umi Control, and more don't need it. Pot of Desires, on the other hand, is always a risk. 10 cards can be a fourth of your whole deck. And although you can partially offset this risk by running cards that are able to scale the number of banished cards like Grand Magi de Aiza, the risk persists. There's always a chance that in 10 cards lost, you'll remove something you'd rather draw. And that chance is always considerable enough that most people play the card by using it after they've already done their combo. But despite its downsides, it's evident from the enormous number of duelists who choose to take a Pot of Desires risk that doing so could be well worth it. Aren't desires to be chased after all? Trading in for the number 1 spot on this list is a normal spell that's been around since 2002, though most duelists wouldn't acquire their own copy until 2004 when it saw a wide release in Dark Beginning 1. Those few secret rare originals came in a promotional bundle alongside Graceful Dice and Skull Dice with Yu-Gi-Oh! The Eternal Duelist for the Game Boy Advance. That's right, we're talking about the time-honored spell and anime plot mechanic, Exchange. Upon activation, both players will reveal their hand and select one of their opponent's cards to take into their own. It's a trade, an exchange. At its baseline, the math doesn't add up to Exchange's owner's advantage. And literally, because using Exchange is always going to be a -1 in card advantage. But Exchange is also a gambit, and it might pay off masterfully. Let's take a peek at the card art, for example, of hugely successful Exchange. In it, we see 2 revealed hands. Duelist 1 has Exodia the Forbidden One, Right Leg of the Forbidden One, Left Arm of the Forbidden One, and Mirror Force. Duelist 2 has Raigeki, Pot of Greed, Dark Magician, and Time Wizard. Or actually, Duelist 2 had Raigeki, and Duelist 1 had Exodia the Forbidden One. The art of Exchange shows both of these cards to be the ones chosen for taking. Let's say Duelist 2 was the one who activated Exchange because anything else doesn't make any sense. It's generally not in your favor to grant extra card advantage to an Exodia deck, but despite this, Duelist 2's Exchange gamble is going to pay off in a major way. Since the beginning of the game, every Exodia piece has been limited to 1 copy. And since the Exodia win condition can only be achieved when a copy of every piece is in your hand, Duelist 2 has probably won this duel without summoning any monsters or inflicting any damage. All they have to do now is take a risk and activate Exchange. Why Duelist 1 swipe Raigeki when they were already sitting on Mirror Force instead of taking the sweet Pot of Greed is a mystery. But maybe they didn't know its effect. Pot of Greed, what does it do? No one knows. Exchange is a gamble, but as the person playing the card, you can swing the odds in your favor through timing and hand manipulation. Did you draw a Garnet or other card that'll just sit dead in your hand? Give that purposeless piece of cardstock to your opponent and take something from them that you can actually play. Steal Nibiru the Primal Being and start link climbing in total safety. If you're playing Master Duel, take your opponent's single copy of Branded Fusion and count the seconds until they scoop. Exchange is a big risk. But duelists have been winning even bigger for years, with decks that slot Exchange consistently scoring competitive TCG placements each year to the tune of 1 or 2 odd appearances per year. Then 2013 happened, and the use of Exchange increased drastically with the rise of the prominence of Prophecy decks. In 2014, usage had dropped off again, however. Often, Exchange would find its spots in side decks over main, giving duelists the option to levy its expensive and risky powers to hand-rip threats in games 2 and 3. In the Duel Monsters anime, Exchange was one of those cards everyone seemed to have and used it when it suited them. In episode 76, Yami-Yugi's duel against Merrick Ishtar through the proxy of the brainwashed Joey Wheeler. The stakes are high in that both duelists were tied to an anchor that will drop into the Battle City Harbor, and only the winner will have the ability to free themselves. During the duel, Yami-Yugi drew Joey's Red Eyes Black Dragon, which he had temporarily taken ownership of after winning it back from the unnamed rare hunter who somehow had 3 copies of every Exodia card. Yugimoto overpowered the Pharaoh to play Exchange against the spirit of the puzzle's wishes in a huge gamble that Joey's connection to his Red Eyes might shock his bestie back to his senses. Merrick was thrilled at this decision, and attempted to influence Joey to take back his ace monster, but Joey resisted and instead grabbed card destruction. Much later in episode 96, Yami Bakura and Yami Merrick duel through the night atop the Kaiba Court blimp. Yami Bakura, temporarily hosting the displaced spirit of Merrick Ishtar, had advanced knowledge of Yami Merrick's strategies, and leveraged this insight to counter Yami Merrick's The Winged Dragon of Ra, using Exchange to steal Merrick's only copy of the God card. Unfortunately, this strategy would ultimately fail, as Yami Merrick would activate Joyful Doom, an anime-exclusive card that interferes with an opponent's attempt to tribute summon by reducing the attack of the tributes to 0 and gaining life points equal to the result. This caused the Winged Dragon of Ra's anime effect of gating the sum of its tributes to result in Egyptian God with an attack of 0. Yami Bakura would later give up the ghost and tribute Ra to summon Dark Ruler Hades, a mistake that would ultimately cost him the duel, since the monster reborn claimed by Yami Merrick during Exchange would let him revive his God card. Exchange would again return in episode 129, this time used by Yami-Yugi to reclaim Slifer the Sky Dragon from Seto Kaiba during the Battle City semifinals after it was stolen through the effective Lullaby of Obedience. A little later in episode 138, Yami-Yugi would use Exchange in his Battle City finals match against Yami Merrick. Having noted Merrick's tendency to dump his god into the grave and bring it back with Monster Reborn, Yugi made sure to use Exchange to take this card from Merrick. Finally, Exchange would be used by Raphael, against Yami-Yugi this time, in their desert duel from episode 156. Raphael activated this card while both duelists had 1 card main in hand, creating a forced trade situation where Yami-Yugi had to take temporary ownership of the Silver Calcos, an evil but powerful card that would prove too tempting to the Pharaoh. resulting in the Great Leviathan absorbing the soul of Yugimoto after the Spirit of the Puzzle played the seal and then lost. Exchanged gets number 1 for its storied place in the Duel Monsters anime, and for its niche competitive experimentation. There's an old saying, and it's forewarned is forearmed. What it means is that by anticipating events, one is better positioned to react to them. Logically, it follows that running a chance strat with multiple potential outcomes is the best way to outplay your opponent in Yu-Gi-Oh! What they fail to predict, they will fail to defend against, right? Well, wrong, because cards that rely on rolls of dice are notoriously bad. But we're not done with logic yet. If chance cards are usually bad, then the ones with the wildest, most unpredictable effects are most likely to counterbalance the trend of their nature, right? Well, wrong again. But unpredictable chance cards are fun, and this list is going to run down some of the most left field unpredictable dice cards in the game. And at number 10, we have Dangerous Machine Type 6. This classic continuous spell was first released in the TCG as a Duelist League promo exclusive, but would later see wider circulation with it including the 2008 set Light of Destruction. It rolls a dice during each of your standby phases and activates a different effect to coincide with each result. On a 1, you discard a card. On a 2, your opponent does the same. On a 3, you'll draw a card. On 4, your opponent gets 2. On a 5, you'll destroy an opponent's monster, and on a 6, Dangerous Machine Type 6 destroys itself. Despite its various effects, it's a pretty simple card, which makes it a good starting spot for this list. Each turn, a dice is rolled and something happens. The major downside of Dangerous Machine Type 6 isn't even its negative effects, but rather that it must be resolved during your standby phase. This means that the turn you activate it, your dice will go unrolled, and if your opponent has anything capable of popping back row, you probably won't be rolling any dice at all. Let's actually keep Snight Hunter on screen for a second, because both this card and Dangerous Machine Type 6 are featured in the artwork of the dice support card, That's 6. This continuous trap has the effect of letting the player change all odd dice results to a 1, and all even die results to a 6. Also pictured on the card is Terror King Archfiend, and you'll notice none of the entities depicted are doing super great. That's because Terror King Archfiend, Snipe Hunter, and Dangerous Machine Type 6 all don't want to roll 1s or 6s, making that 6 a very specific counter to them personally. With Snipe Hunter, you can discard a card to roll a dice, and a resulting 2, 3, 4, or 5, you can pop an opponent's card. Terror King Archfiend can roll a dice when it's designated as a target, and negate the effect on a 2 or 5. In the shadow of an enemy, that's 6, neither of these fiends are winning any rolls. We've already covered what happens when Dangerous Machine Type 6 turns out a 1 or 6, but to reiterate, that 6 turns this card into a coin flip between discarding 1 and blowing itself up. Ironically, that 6 is a card that can really help pretty much every other dice roller on this list. Ushering in an age of all-consuming darkness at spot number 9 is the level 8 Ritual Fiend Darkmaster Zorg. With 2700 attack and 1500 defense, the Darkmaster has a stat line befitting his epithet. But the true destructive power is in its effect. Once per turn, Zorg can roll a 6-sided die. On a 1 or 2, Zorg annihilates every monster on your opponent's board. On a 3, 4, or 5, he destroys one enemy monster. On a 6, the dark powers of the Darkmaster are too unpredictable and destructive, and he blows up. Unlike Dangerous Machine Type 6, the Darkmaster's self-destruction is not self-contained. On a 6, Zork destroys every monster on your board. Overall, Zork has a good effect that can easily swing the outcome of the game in either direction, and Zork still sees some competitive play in Guild format, where the suddenness with which it can hit the field makes it a real threat. Usually, a deck running Zork will meet its 8 level of tribute cost by running a copy of the Mass Beast, which can be searched with the same generic ritual supports that serve Zork, and summoned by the attribute-specific ritual spell Contract with the Abyss. For this reason, Zork's intended ritual spell Contract with the Dark Master is often completely dropped, since many early level rituals lacked useful bells and whistles that would become the norm later on. Calling Zork an early ritual monster is right, since he first released in 2003 with the Dark Crisis set, but its appearance actually predates its arrival to the TCG. Although this card would never appear in the Duel Monsters anime, it would appear during the Monster World arc from the original Yu-Gi-Oh manga. In the story, Yugi and the gang are forced to play Yamabakura's Shadow Game, where they have to storm a castle taken over by the Dark Master, utilizing Dungeons and Dragons style dice rolling to progress the story and combat foes. In the anime, this encounter with Yamabakura is reimagined into the Dream Duel where Yugi, Joey, Tristan, and Taya all temporarily become their favorite cards. But in Duel Links, duelists could play out Bakura's original RPG during the tabletop RPG Monster World event. This is because the Duel Links world follows the Duel Monsters manga rather than the anime, which is probably why characters from the anime's filler arcs like Noah Kaiba and Raphael haven't appeared in-game. Fizzling and crackling all the way to the number 8 on this list is Hinezumi Hanabi. Originally released in 2020's Phantom Rage set, This level 4 Fire Beast monster has 2000 attack and 200 defense, which is a respectable stat line for a low-level normal summon. But Hinazumi Hanabi's got a little bit more going on than Gmord Warwolf. When summoned, this fiery mouse collects 6 counters and cannot be used as a material for Synchro, Xyz, Fusion, or Link summon. When it hits the field, Hanabi is probably going to stick around, at least until it removes itself with its own effect, which will happen, because those counters are counting down. And when they're all gone, Hanabi will explode, dealing 2000 damage to its controller. The monster is actually a game of hot potato, because during the end phase, control of Hanabi changes, and when that happens, its new controller must roll a 6-sided die, removing counters equal to the result. When will Hinazumi Hanabi blow up? Well, it depends on the die. But with only 6 counters, it hasn't got the longest fuse in the world. Let's look at some rolls and outcomes. If the turn player summons Hanabi, first roll will go to your opponent. If your opponent rolls a 6, Hanabi spontaneously combusts, so that's an unlikely but not inconsequential 16.67% chance. If your opponent rolls lower than the most they possibly can, Hanabi's original owner will take second roll. There are 36 ways to roll a pair of dice, and only 10 of them save the second controller from Hanabi's fallout, which means they have a whopping 72.2% chance outright of catching Flaming Mouse Shrapnel, but those odds can be adjusted. If you're anticipating ownership of Hinazumi Hanabi, you might have prepared text that can work around its constraints to remove it from the board while gaining advantage. Still, this card is a cool combination of easy to get on the field, silly dice rolling effects, and fun design. While Hinazumi is a mythological fire rap and Hanabi means firework, the idea is that when you play Hinazumi Hanabi, you're lighting a firework. When will it go off? Where will it point when sparks fly? This next card could probably take a spot further up this list, but it'd be wrong to not give number 7 number 7. Number 7, Lucky Straight, is a rank 7 light fairy with 700 attack and 700 defense. Finally, it requires an overlay of 3 level 7 monsters to XC summon. Its initial stats are a bit low, but those are going to change once you detach one overlay unit to activate Lucky Straight's effect to roll 2 dice. Firstly, Lucky Straight's attack is going to increase by 700 times the higher roll until your opponent's next end phase. That means that if either of the dice lands on a 6, Lucky Straight's attack is climbing to a whopping 4900 attack at max. Lucky Straight's always going to gain attack, but if the sum of your 2 rolls is 7, it gets to choose another effect from its menu of 3 enticing options. Lucky Straight has a choice of sending every other card on the field to the graveyard, which is big, but you also have the option to special summon a monster from hand or either graveyard, or for its final effect, Lucky Straight can also mimic Graceful Charity by letting you draw 3 and then discard 2. All of these effects are pretty powerful and versatile, but exactly how lucky do you have to be to experience the windfall of choosing one? When rolling a pair of dice, there are 36 possible permutations. Of those 36 are 6 scenarios that add to 7, giving you a 16.7% or 1 in 6 odds of resolving one of Lucky Straight's lucky effects. Although that's not the best chance ever, it is worth noting that 7 is the most common individual result when rolling a pair of dice. Number 7, Lucky Straight, actually saw decent experimentation during Dragon Ruler format, since the state of the meta saw an influx of level 7s taking the field. But what's up with 7 anyways? Why so many 7s? Well, there's not really one answer beyond the fact that it's a commonly recurring number in both culture and nature. 7 is the only prime number to precede a cube, and the religious reference to it are plentiful. The 7 classical planets, which aren't really planets, just the major celestial bodies you can see from Earth with just your eye, which were the original modus behind the 7 days of the week. Many folkloric traditions maintain that a 7th son is born with occult powers, and 7th son of the 7th son is born with healing powers. This superstition is often mixed with other bits of supernatural folklore to create an origin story for werewolves and vampires. Also notable are the 7 gods of good fortune from Japanese mythology. There's just a lot hovering in the aether around the mystical number 7, and number 7, Lucky Straight, is a fascinating accent artifact to surface in the super significance of superstition. Nice try every other card in the game, none of you can withstand the force of number 6 pick, Orgoth the Relentless, a level 7 Earth Warrior with 2500 attack and 2450 defense. That finally released to massive adoration and acclaim from duelists internationally with the Battle of Legend Relentless Revenge set in 2018. Duke Devilin's Ace monster strikes hard and fast, and rolls 3 dice in activation of its effect. During the main phase, you can increase Orgoth's stats by 100 times the sum of your 3 dice rolls. But that's just what happens every time. If any 2 of your rolled dice are the same, Orgoth gains an additional effect. If you've duplicated 1s or 2s, Orgoth cannot be destroyed by battle or card effects until the next turn, which isn't bad. If you've got double 3s or 4s, you can draw 2, which is way better. On repeats 5s or 6, Orgoth can attack directly, which is nothing to sneeze at since his attack will be an absolute minimum 3600, and that's only if you roll 2 5s and a 1. On 2 6s and a 5, your opponent is staring down a hulking behemoth with glowing eyes, a diamond blade, and 4200 attack. But what happens if you roll 3 of a kind? Then Orgoth does everything. Attack and defense increase, he's protected from battle and effect destruction, you draw 2, and he can attack directly. He is absolutely relentless. It's time to do some math. There is always math. When all of this is gone, there will only be math. Per the laws of math, by which all things abide and someday die, 216 outcomes exist to the activation of Orgoth the Relentless effect. There are exactly 6 ways you can roll 3 of a kind. 111, 222, 333, 444, 555, and 666. There are also exactly 6 ways you can resolve a single one of Orgoth's additional effects. For example, if you want to draw 2 cards, the following permutations would yield a success. 3x3, x33, 33x, 4x4, x44, and 44x. This means that in Orgoth's tree of outcomes, you have a 2.8% or 1 in 36 chance of resolving all 3 of Orgoth's effects. Since you have the same odds of activating Orgoth effect in isolation, your odds of seeing an individual Orgoth effect are actually 5.6%. Your odds of seeing any additional Orgoth effect at all are surprisingly decent at 1 in 36 chance, or 11.11%. No matter what, you'll be seeing a stat boost, but the sheer amount of outcomes Orgoth provides, combined with his very important place in Duel Monsters lore as the Ace of Duke Devlin, the single most important card in any anime or story ever, makes Orgoth worthy of note and praise. He's Orgoth and he's relentless, and he's coming for your life points. All of them. And crushing the competition to claim a sweet number 5 is number 67, Paradise Smasher. This rank 5 Xyz monster is a light fairy, 2100 attack and defense, that can be brought out with entirely generic materials. Fittingly, it released alongside Orgoth the Relentless in Battle of Legend, Relentless Revenge. And like Orgoth, the dice will be flying. Once during your main phase 1, you can activate Paradise Smasher's effect by detaching 2 materials to make both players roll 2 dice. The player with the higher total is locked out of activating monster effects or declaring attacks until the end of their next turn. This is a wild risk and could result in a wildly diverse array of game states for both players. Unless you tie, someone's going to win and someone's going to lose. And isn't that what Yu-Gi-Oh really is in a nutshell? But Paradise Smasher's Dice Hammer crushes nutshells and anything else it comes down on. If Paradise Smasher still has an Xyz material after activating its effect, the controlling player can change one of the results to a 7, which makes it hard to lose the Paradise roll-off. But how hard? Time for some more math. As previously established during the number 7 lucky straight part of this video, there are 36 outcomes from rolling a pair of dice. If one of those results is always going to be 7, that generates less outcomes. It's actually just 6. You're looking at 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, and 13 as potential results. And since 21 out of the 36 possible sums when rolling a pair of dice are less than 8, an activation of number 67, Paradise Smasher, with materials left over gives you an outright 58.3, repeating of course, % chance of winning. And that's just the baseline. If you roll low, your odds are even better. And that's also limiting number 67 Paradise Smasher to its own dice rolling effect. If you choose not to activate, Paradise Smasher still lets you turn a die result into a 7 once per turn. This makes it able to fix the outcome for cards that want to roll high like Graceful Dice and even Snipe Hunter, who doesn't actually want to roll high but specifically avoid a 6, which ding ding ding, a 7 does that. Unlike many other dice cards, Paradise Smasher is fairly reliable. Where the unpredictability sets in is with its versatility. What impact will an activation of Paradise Smasher have on the game? What card is getting the adjustment 7? Slightly taking this chance to claim spot number 4 is Royal Rhino with Deceitful Dice. This level 1 Earth Beast has 600 attack and defense and broke out of containment with the 2024 set Phantom Nightmare. Just look at this card, it's magnificent. And it has an effect to match its card Shark Swagger. Once per turn, you can roll 6-sided die as a quick effect. Then things get a little complicated. See, Royal Rhino has 3 other effects, with each of those effects scaling in strength based on the roll of the die, which effect is chosen by the chain link Royal Rhino is activated on. On chain link 2, Royal Rhino will gain attack equal to the die result times 500 until the end of the turn, making it a potential 3600 attack normal summon. Or even 4100 if you're a dedicated Dice Fiend and already have number 67 Paradise Smasher on the board. But attack gains are fickle, and the battle phase is long and full of terrors. So Royal Rhino enjoyers will probably aim to roll the Deceitful Dice on chain link 3 or 4. On 3, you'll inflict damage to your opponent equal to the die result times 500, meaning you can deal up to 3000 directly, which can absolutely swing games. Chainlink 4 though, well, that's where the big Royal Rhino plays live. When you roll a Chainlink 4, you can destroy cards on the field equal to the die roll. Multi-card chosen without target removal is pretty epic, and so is Royal Rhino with deceitful dice. What's it gonna do? You can't know, for its dice are deceitful. They lie, its plays are unpredictable, and its attire is sharp. Sometimes everything comes down to a single roll, and that roll is pretty much any time the number 3 pick Dice Jar activates its flip effect. This level 3 light rock with 200 attack and 300 defense released in the 2003 set Pharaonic Guardian, and is so unpredictable yet devastating that it has seen a scant handful of competitive placements despite being a low-statted flip effect monster. When flipped, Dice Jar forces both players to roll a 6-sided die. The player with the lower roll takes damage equal to the higher roll times 500. Draw results re-roll until a winner is clear. This can already add up to a lot of damage. After all, 5 times 500 is 2500, and that equals to a direct attack from a Dark Magician. But here's the real kicker. If the winning roll of Dice Jar's effect is a 6, the lower roll player takes 6,000 damage. Effects that deal such extreme heights of burn are rare in Yu-Gi-Oh! Because of how powerful it is to instantly inflict damage. Dice Jar can boast such a wild burn ceiling because of the associated risk. Your opponent might roll well, or skewer you with 6,000 damage. This is where cards like That 6 and number 67 Paradise Smasher really shine. Being able to fix the dice roll turns this toss-up gimmick card into a gimmick card with actual potential. Dice Jar FTK strategies often use cards like Paw of Duality or Rock Bombardment, plus a Feather the Phoenix to search out Dice Jar, and follow-up cards with Book of Eclipse, Book of Moon, or Book of Taiyu to recurse its flip effect. Dice Jar can end you on any turn. It can be hidden behind any set monster. It's probably behind you right now. It senses fear and feeds on attention. Just pretend it'll go away, and that'll probably work, sure. Number 2 is number 85, Crazy Box. It would be a Shadow Realm worthy offense to put together a list of unpredictable dice cards and not include the Crazy Box. This rank 4 Dark Fiend requires an overlay of 2 generic level 4s to summon, and comes with an intimidating 3000 attack, and mostly ignored 300 defense. Alright, so Crazy Box, let's talk about it. A completely generic rank 4 3000 attack is awesome, being a Dark Fiend is great. Unfortunately, Crazy Box can't actually attack. Yeah, that might seem puzzling, but Crazy Box attack stat isn't what makes Crazy Box unpredictable or even good, which it is. We've all seen a monster with 3000 attack before, but there's only one Crazy Box. You can activate the effect of Crazy Box once per turn by detaching an overlay unit, after which you must roll a dice. Like another dice monster that saw oodles of competitive play, with Crazy Box we're looking for a 2, 3, 4, or 5. A roll of 1 halves your life points, which isn't fantastic, but not always detrimental. You only need 1 life point to win after all. But if you roll a 6, then Crazy Box self-destructs, which is unacceptable, because if you're not playing Crazy Box, what's the point? The point is to not roll a 1 or a 6, because on rolling a 2, you get to draw a card. If you roll a 3, your opponent must discard a card. You can negate the effect of one face-up card on the field until the end of the turn on a 4, and when you net a 5, you can pop a card on the field. Isn't that crazy? And you know what else is crazy? Number 85 Crazy Box released in 2013's Number Hunter set alongside fellow box card Box of Friends. Could a relatively strategic deck be crafted entirely of box cards without resorting to just running battling boxers? Create something, do it, explain in the comments, do it for Crazy Box. And speaking of Crazy Box and doing things, Crazy Box did a ton of competitive play. Its easiness to summon potential upsides are way more important than what might happen if Crazy Box rolls wrong. If you can't focus tunnel vision on a possible future victory, how will you ever feel anything but despair when you face down a Trap Tricks player? And racing for the first place, the number 1 spot for the final finish, is FA Dead Heat from 2018's Flame of Destruction set. It was a tough call between this continuous trap and number 85 Crazy Box. So tough you might call it a Dead Heat, and maybe that's what clinched it at the end. But enough silliness, we're racing now because that's what FA Dead Heat is all about. The whole FA archetype is about racing, with FA standing for Formula Athlete. These cards are actually related to the UA Ultra Athlete archetype, with both sets of cards canonically competing in events in the same UA Hyper Stadium, which is a rebuilt and tricked out version of UA Stadium, where these dual monsters sporting events picked up enough momentum to launch a racing franchise. True to its name, FA Dead Heat makes you and your opponent race with dice. For starters, on a direct attack from your opponent, you can summon an FA monster from your deck, which branches into Dead Heat's second effect, which is where the dice and wheels get rolling. Once per battle that involves one of your FA monsters, both players roll a 6-sided die. If your result is higher, you can increase the level of your FA monster by 4 until the end of the turn. If your opponent's roll is higher, well, you lose the race as your FA monster spins out, crashes, and burns. There are no ties either. Under FA Dead Heat, you and your opponent re-roll same results until someone's a winner. Usually, levels don't dictate damage calculation, but the FA archetype has a fun mechanic where their levels are treated like speed. With every level, they gain momentum and attack strength to the tune of 300 attack per level. So FA Hang On Mock, which is a level 4 wind machine with 1800 defense and 0 base attack, will land on the field in 4th gear with an attack value of 1200. Those 4 levels gained from winning FA Dead Heat roll translate into additional 1200 attack that may let you outspeed your opponent to destroy their monster. To complement their stat increases, FA monsters can also often achieve strong latent effects once they reach a certain degree of speed. For FA Hang On Mock, when it reaches or exceeds level 7, it applies a powerful floodgate that causes all cards sent to your opponent's graveyard to redirect into the banished pile instead. FA Dark Dragster can decrease its level by 3 to pop a card on the field. But how do these cards get going? Aside from FA Auto Navigator, which searches, and FA Shining Star GT, which does something similar but with athlete counters, all FA monsters gain a level each time an FA spell or trap card is activated. Dead Heat not only boosts the attack points of your cards, but can help them realize their full potential. When FA Hang On Mock wins a Dead Heat race, and then destroys your opponent's monster, its one-sided macrocosmos will make sure that monster is banished instead of being destroyed and sent to the graveyard. And while this is a very cool effect that synergizes with both cards' narrative and playstyle, it is by definition unpredictable. Dead Heat, no one has won yet, and just from watching, there can be no discerning who's going to. The only thing left to do is roll some dice and floor it. At its core, Yu-Gi-Oh! And pretty much all trading card games are a game of chance. You and your opponent shuffle your deck, draw your starting hand, and then it's off to the races until someone wins and someone loses. Or you inevitably run out of time during Game 3 and have to call the match a draw. But for this list, we're mostly concerned with the gamble of winning or losing. Heads or tails? We're lining up the 10 most impactful coin flip cards because Yu-Gi-Oh! Is a game of chance made up of smaller games of chance. Will you draw the out? Will 3000 attack be enough to beat over your opponent's board? Will Time Wizard clear your opponent's board or your own? Are you feeling lucky? As fun as games of chance are, wagering the outcome of a duel on a coin flip is always going to be at its absolute best a 50-50. But what if it could be better than that? So to kick off this list at number 10, we have a continuous spell called Second Coin Toss. It was released in 2003's Legacy of Darkness set and has a very simple but impactful effect. Anytime a coin toss is performed and you don't like the result, you can redo it once. It's not as explosive as the rest of this list, but this card is something that almost no other coin toss card is. Consistent. There's no penalty for second coin toss. The entire point of this card is to mitigate the shared flaw of all coin flip effects, which is that you might get stuck with an unwanted result. We can actually quantify the utility second coin toss with math. Yay, math! We all love math. So here's the setup. You've got 250 life points left and nothing in hand on field except for a single Time Wizard. Your opponent has 3 blue eyes white dragons and might be Seto Kaiba. You might be the underdog of the situation, but what if you top deck a second coin toss? Let's see how this scenario changes. With just Time Wizard, you've got a 50% chance of making those blue eyes a thing of the past, but also a 50% chance of blowing yourself up on the spot. It could be worse, but with second coin toss, it gets better. Now, your only lose condition is missing 2 consecutive calls. With second coin toss, you brought your chances of success up to a much friendlier 75%. But here's where things get really interesting. The benefits of this effect can scale. Let's look at Sand Gambler's effect. It's pretty similar to Time Wizard, except you're flipping 3 coins instead of 1. If all 3 coins are heads, all of your opponent's monsters are destroyed. 3 tails, and this same destruction falls on your field. While the base odds of Sand Gambler's success are lower, we're looking at a 1 in 8 or 12.5% chance of hitting. Your chance of self-destruction is also lower. Now let's get second coin tossing. The numeral odds of success are now 23.44%. But what about failure? Let's see what happens. You now have 1 lose condition out of 64 possible configurations of coins, which is having the cataclysmic bad luck of flipping 6 consecutive tails. There's a 1.56% chance of Sand Gambler's bet blowing back on you. Second coin toss is impactful because it radically shifts the odds of every coin toss you perform, but while that is certainly enough to find a spot on this list, it'll have to land at number 10 because activated alone, it does literally nothing. Hope everyone's not tired about hearing the Sand Gambler, because in the 2000 set Gladiator's Assault, he got a retrade, and that card has the dubious fortune of finding a spot on this list. But way down at number 9. Gambler of Legend is a level 4 dark spellcaster with 500 attack and 1400 defense. and ruggishly roguish good looks. Like his suave pal Sand Gambler, this swashbuckling chance fiend tosses 3 coins. But where Sand Gambler fizzles most of the time, exactly 75% of the time actually, the odds of actions are stacked way more in Gambler of Legend's favor. When Gambler of Legend activates its effect, something's always going to happen. And on 3 heads, it's the familiar effect to destroy all of your opponent's monsters. Same with tails, but for you. On 2 heads, Gambler of Legend will discard a random card from your opponent's hand, which is great. On only 1 heads, you'll have to destroy a card you control, which is less great but also not super bad, because you'll get to choose what gets the axe. Let's do some more math. Flipping 3 coins results in 8 possible outcomes with a 12.5% chance of seeing each. 2 of those outcomes are the board clears, while the remaining 6 are split evenly between outcomes with 2 heads and 2 tails. This results in a 37.5% chance of discarding from your opponent's hand, a 37.5% chance of popping a card on your field, and a 12.5% chance of regacking your opponent, and a 12.5% chance of losing all of your monsters. In the end, the math comes out to 50-50 between good and bad effects. The wide range of outcomes here secures Gambler of Legend's spot on this list. When its effect is activated, the duel state is going to shift. What it will look like is anyone's guess, but no one can know until the coins have landed and the effect resolves. And taking home the trophy for the number 8 spot are 2 cards. Cup of Ace is a normal spell where coin flip is flipped, and then if heads you draw 2 cards, and tails your opponent draws 2. The ability to costlessly go +1 in card advantage has been around forever, and will simply never be unbanned. But as good as the potential upside of Cup of Ace is, the power level of this card is mitigated by the downside being even worse. If you succeed in Ace Toss, you'll go +1. If you fail, your opponent basically goes +3 in card advantage, as you lose 1 card from your hand and your opponent gains 2 new cards in their hand. This doesn't make the card unusable by any means, however, but if you're relying on a Cup of Ace top deck to make your play, well, you're in a desperate spot for sure. But desperate spots happen all the time, and all you need is a little luck to win big. As often is the case with chance-based cards, they synergize the strongest with decks that can pivot their bad effects into advantage. Take for example, Taya Burn, a strategy in Duel Links enabled by the smaller deck size of 20 cards, lowering starting life point value 4,000, and Taya Gardner's Duel Standby skill to increase the starting hand size to the usual 5 cards. This FTK burn deck was able to reliably see multiple copies of Restructured Revolution, a card that burns your opponent for 200 times the number of cards in their hand. This turned a tails result of Cup of Ace into as much as 1,200 extra damage if you were to resolve all 3 copies of your Restructured Revolutions. Actually, 3 Restructured Revolutions against a 7-card hand is a guaranteed OTK of 4,200 damage. This strategy wouldn't survive Konami's decision to clobber it remorselessly with the Nerf hammer, but for a time it was a staggeringly dangerous deck. Cup of Ace came out way back in 2008 with the Light of Destruction set, but it actually got a retrain in the 2023 set, Photon Hypernova. Couple of Aces is a level 2 Earth Fairy with 100 attack and defense. Like its inspiration, Cup of Ace, 2 of which are actually depicted being worn by the Aces couple in the new card art. Couple of Aces does a coin flip. When it's in your hand, you can toss a coin. On heads, you special summon Couple of Aces to your field and draw 2 cards. Tails, your opponent does the same thing. It's just like Cup of Aces, but more intense. You win and lose bigger, but don't think about losing. Just think about winning. The odds of pulling off a Couple of Aces coin toss are better than top decking the exact card you need, right? By that logic, Couple of Aces should be run at 3 in every deck. Unfortunately, the usual reality of this card is that it's just too risky for most people to use, leaving this Couple of Ace cards to be the sole province of the true Mad Lads who fear neither defeat nor the Shadow Realm. This time-honored level 2 light spellcaster with 500 attack and 400 defense has already come up a few times in this video, but now that we're number 7 spot, it's high time we talked more about the Time Wizard. It's a fact it should be old news by now, but let's rewind the clock and review. Time Wizard lets you toss a coin and call it. If you're right, you destroy all your opponent's monsters. If you're wrong, you destroy all of your monsters, and you lose life points equal to half the attack of all of your monsters. Technically, this is a better deal for your opponent, but life points are cheap as long as you're above 0, and you get to choose when to ignite the effect, letting you deploy it when the possible benefits to you outweigh the cost of failure. Unfortunately, Time Wizard isn't super good. It's been around since the dawn of time. 2002's Metal Raider set to be specific, and even got a retrain in the form of Time Wizard Tomorrow in 2020's Dragon of Legends, the complete series. But even this stronger form couldn't tweak the odds enough to make Time Wizard see competitive play, beyond being a decent instant fusion target on account of being level 5 light spellcaster. So why is Time Wizard on this list? Well, because of its importance to the Duel Monsters anime, and because of Dark Sage. We'll talk about anime first, because that will help this bizarre piece of Merry Time Wizard times Dark Magician support make a little bit more sense. Way back in episode 3, Journey to the Duelist Kingdom, Yugimoto opens the gold sarcophagus he keeps cards in to give his bestie Joey Wheeler a gift to soup up his deck before the big Duelist Kingdom tournament, the Time Wizard. This would prove to be a foundational moment for Joey Wheeler, whose pluck and determination would later be represented by his preference for cards that rely on chance. Time Wizard was the first of Joey's long-shot cards, and forms a core part of his dueling strategy. Frequently, Joey used Time Wizard to bounce back when the situation looked dire. It's what let Joey crumble Rex Raptor's Red Eyes Black Dragon to dust and claim the card as his own, and also let him overcome My Valentine's onslaught of Harpies, turning them old while accelerating the age of his own baby dragon so it grew into its more powerful form, Thousand Dragon. In the TCG, Thousand Dragon is a fusion monster requiring Time Wizard and Baby Dragon as materials, which isn't really how Joey used it, but also most of the time Joey used Time Wizard like a spell card rather than a monster anyway. The rules of the game during the duel monsters weren't particularly well defined, but let's chat about Dark Sage, because in the anime it's very similar to Thousand Dragon, as it can only hit the field when a Dark Magician is aged 1,000 years by Time Wizard's effect. Funnily enough, the TCG version of Dark Sage isn't a fusion monster. Instead, it can tribute Dark Magician from your field to special summon itself from your deck when you call a Time Wizard coin toss correctly. It's a cool translation of the anime effect, but outrageously silly to actually pull off. But Yugi did it in his duel against Joey Wheeler during the Duelist Kingdom finals. After Joey attempted to clear Yugi's board for game with Time Wizard, Yugi surprised his friend with his secret evolution to Dark Magician. Ultimately, this calls Yugi's original gift to Joey into question. While it does help give context to Yugi's original ownership of the Time Wizard since it's technically Dark Magician support, you do have to wonder why Yugi never mentioned Dark Sage to Joey. Unless Yugi intended for this to result in a prospective bout with his best friend. With the gift of Time Wizard, the future King of Games both helped his friend succeed and sabotaged his chances to win with Dark Sage hidden and waiting and ready to strike. Much to ponder here. Spot number 6 belongs to a normal trap card you'd honestly hope to never have to use, Gamble. It's been over 20 years since this card's release in 2002's Pharaoh's Servant set, and in that time it's never seen play and probably never will. As you might have guessed from this card's name and presence on this list, using this card is a real last-ditch poly of the desperate, which is emphasized by its pretty strict activation requirement. You can only resolve Gamble when your opponent has 6 or more cards in their hand while you have less than 3. Like every other card in this video, Gamble makes you toss a coin. Call it right and you can draw until you have a full hand of 5 cards. Miss the call and you have to skip your next turn. This card is a pretty life or death, since losing a whole turn is often just going to be the game, and especially when your opponent is ahead in card advantage. That Gamble is a trap card that doesn't help. If you've got your back against the wall and drawn to Gamble, it's usually too late to use it. Still, as restrictive and clunky as Gamble is, on successful resolution and call, it's a minimum of a +2 in card advantage and a maximum of a +4. And these additional cards come with no extra restrictions. You aren't archetype locked or limited on your summons or activations. It's not a card you ever really want to need, but its impact is extreme. You'll either turn a hopeless situation back into an even game, or turn your premature burial into a foolish one. Shockingly, this card has an impressive roster of anime appearances across multiple generations. In the OG Duel Monster series, this card is used by Joey Wheeler and can be seen in his hand during his duel against the Big Five in episode 112, and against Yami Merrick again in episode 127. That he had this card against Yami Merrick is interesting because it first became part of his deck during Noah's Virtual World arc, where instead of bringing their decks with them into cyberspace, players assembled their decks from a Master Duel style editor prior to their first match. Joey loaded Gamble into his deck for his duel against Johnson, the former Kaiba Corp legal advisor. One of the big 5 that aided Pegasus is an attempted coup of Kaiba Corp. The manga incarnation of Johnson was simply fired by Seto Kaiba in retaliation for his duplicity. In the anime, the Big 5 got 2 different filler arcs where they got trapped in the virtual worlds of walking and sometimes talking duel monsters. In the virtual world arc where Joey dueled Johnson, the fallen lawyer assumed the form of the Judge Man. The stakes of the duel were high. Joey had a body, but Johnson didn't, and since both of their brains were trapped in the virtual world, the winner of the duel would claim Joey Wheeler's body. Joey, never afraid of taking a risk, stocked his deck with chance cards, which was a mistake since Johnson could determine the results of all of Joey's chance cards. Was this cheating? Yes. Yes, it was. The stranded consciousness of Noah Kaiba, Gozaburo Kaiba's biological son, who still looks kind of like Seto, arrived and called his underling out for cheating, wanting to discontinue the match. In yet another gutsy and confusing risk, Joey asked Noah to allow Johnson to continue dueling so long as he stopped cheating. Like almost every other risk Joey has ever taken, it wound off paying off, and he won despite losing a gamble call to Johnson's manipulations. Gamble also appeared in the Yu-Gi-Oh! GX closing song and had a spot in Yusei Fudo's deck for a while. even though it was never actually used. It had 2 more minor 5Ds appearances, but whatever. Like anyone brave or base enough to use this card knows, you win some and you lose some. And who cares about Gamble's other 5Ds appearances? We're moving on to number 5. And here we are at number 5. But what's this? Looks like we never left the Judge Man's courtroom because number 5 is the continuous trap Head Judging. It was included in the 2020 set Ignition Assault, and it's got a pretty bananas effect. When your opponent activates a monster effect, you can make them toss a coin and call it. If they get it right, Head Judging goes to the graveyard. If wrong, not only is the effect negated, but you get to slide that monster over to your side of the board. This effect is only once per turn, but that's still 1 negate plus a steal every turn if luck is in your favor. It's a continuous trap, which makes it highly vulnerable to a bazillion different methods of removal, but it does have one thing going for it. Unlike equipped cards like Snatch Steal or Dark Necrofear, control of a stolen monster will not return to your opponent when Head Judging is destroyed. What makes this card good, or well, it's more accurate to say relatively impactful within the context of this list, is its potential infinite upside with no penalty for bad luck. If this card fails, it only fizzles. There's no detonation of your field or skipping your turn. While the application of this card was highly limited, garnering only a scant handful of competitive placements in the TCG, it was busted in Duel Links. As with many cards too finicky to find success in other formats, the Duel Links skill system had a skill called Master of Destiny, which guaranteed your first 3 coin results were heads. However, you wouldn't use this with Head Judging because it made your opponent guess, but it did count towards the number of coin flipping effects you need in your deck in order to make the skill live. This skill alone made coin flipping cards really good by effectively removing the coin flip component and turning them into regular cards, which is kind of silly, but did give coin flip decks a surprising distinction of tiered status for a time. These decks revolved around gaining advantage with your guaranteed flips, then relying on Desperado Barrel Dragon as your boss monster for the mid and late game, if turns should extend that far. At the time of this video, Master of Destiny coin flip isn't the force it once was, but Head Judging has still seen recent experimentation in decks like Altergeist. It would probably see more if it wasn't limited to 1 copy, forcing it to compete with staples like Monster Reborn, Treacherous Trap Hole, and Enemy Controller for spots and deck lists. Funnily enough, back when Master of Destiny coin flip was at its peak strength, decks would often contain both Head Judging and Misjudge, the monster its arc depicts. This list has been full of silly fun cards like Time Wizard and Couple of Aces, but that ends now because here at the number 4 spot, we're entering a twilight realm of shadows, fear, and disembodied mouths and eyes. Watch where you step in Dark Sanctuary because the sky is watching you, and it's very, very hungry. This field spell released in the 2016 set Duelist Pact Rival of the Pharaoh alongside other cards in the anime, like Magnet Force and legacy support for anime featured archetypes like Silent Burning and Silent Swordsman. In episode 82 of the Duel Monsters anime, the spirit forms of Yugi and Bakura squared off once again in the skies above Battle City. It was the first match of the Battle City finals, and Yugi took an early lead by cutting through Bakura's ghoulish ghouls to reduce his opponent's life points down to a critical 150. Unfortunately, when Yugi used Dark Magician Girl to destroy Bakura's Dark Necrofear, this triggered its anime-exclusive effect, allowing Bakura to activate Dark Sanctuary. This card worked a little differently in the anime than it did when it was eventually printed in the TCG. In the anime, Bakura could choose to possess one of Yugi's monsters with the Dark Spirit of the Silent residing in the Sanctuary. When Yugi's infected Gamma the Magnet Warrior attempts to attack Bakura directly for game, Dark Sanctuary negates the attack and inflicts damage equal to half of Gamma's attack to Yugi, while increasing Bakura's life points by the same amount. Because it'd be very convoluted to find a fair way to translate randomly equipping an immaterial Dark Spirit to an opponent's monster before their battle phase, and just trust me bro, that doesn't really cut it, this effect was modified to become a coin flip when Dark Sanctuary was printed. While the TCG version of Dark Sanctuary is on the field, every time your opponent attacks, you can flip a coin. On heads, you negate the attack and inflict half its value as damage. On tails, nothing happens and the attack succeeds. In effect, this makes Dark Sanctuary a less punishing but easier to use fairy box, and with good luck or combined with second coin toss, it can be decent as a stall. But why then is Dark Sanctuary on this list instead of fairy box? And the answer is because of Dark Sanctuary's first effect. When you would place a spirit monster in the field through the effective Destiny board, you can summon it as a monster with no attack or defense instead. The new Spirit Message monster is unaffected by all cards save Destiny board, and can neither be a target of enemy attacks or stop them from attacking directly. It's definitely not enough to make Destiny board a viable win condition, but it does make Destiny board possible by radically shifting the compositions of the board. Destiny board wins you the game by assembling itself and the 4 spirit messages on your field, and it accomplishes this by placing the next subsequent spirit message on your field from hand or deck, during your opponent's end phase. Not only is this painfully slow, but loses to basically everything that lets your opponent pop a card, which is, again, basically everything. You can't even protect your back row with other back row because in order to pull off the win condition, you're going to need every spell and trap. Dark Sanctuary changes this by freeing up the rest of your field for spirit message use and providing them decent protection in addition to its repeating coin flip stall. This bond between Dark Sanctuary and the spirit messages calls back to the same duel against Yugi and Bakura, where Bakura attempted to use the field spell to stall Yu-Gi-Oh for a Destiny board win. Like most people who attempted to assemble the forbidden 5-loaded word final, or the extra forbidden death that was censored to become final when these cards were minted for the internal release, Bakura failed to pull it off. But it was still really cool with its oblique victory maneuver, which was indicative of the layers and layers of tricks, traps, and deceptions prepared by Yami Bakura. And at number 3, we've got another normal trap, Fiend Comedian. Like the other normal trap on this list, Gamble, it released more than 2 decades ago, but in 2003's Legacy of Darkness. Also like Gamble, it's got a crazy impactful effect that can drastically change the state of the game. Unlike Gamble, it's actually pretty good. When you resolve Fiend Comedian, you flip a coin. Shocking, right? Well, its effect will probably be if you've never encountered it before. You call the coin, and if you're right, Fiend Comedian will banish your opponent's entire graveyard. If you call it wrong, you send a number of cards from the top of your deck to the graveyard equal to the amount of cards in your opponent's graveyard. While Gamble can definitely bring you back from the brink, Fiend Comedian is so much easier to use. There's no activation restrictions, and both effects can be situationally beneficial. Calling the coin toss wrong is actually more consistent because you can stack your deck with cards that want to live in your graveyard, and then shift them there in mass. And failing to fail, banishing your opponent's graveyard is big. Outside of a few specific decks that utilize banishing, disrupting your opponent's graveyard in this extreme way is probably only going to help you. It might even shut your opponent down completely if they are graveyard reliant. As befitting its wildly game-changing effect, Fiend Comedian has seen significant competitive play and experimentation. Like all coin flip cards, it has a major downside of unpredictability, and has its own specific limitation of scaling with the size of your opponent's graveyard. If your opponent has too few cards in grave, Fiend Comedian might be too weak to be useful, and in the worst case scenario, if your opponent has a large graveyard, Fiend Comedian might cause you to deck out. Still, these pitfalls aren't enough to prevent Fiend Comedian from seeing use. Its valleys are deep, but its peaks are high, which meshes with the card's design. Being a blend of both Fiend and Comedian, it's difficult to anticipate what fickle outcome will result from slotting this card into your deck list, but therein lies its strength. Like Yugi and the Spirit of the Pharaoh shuffling their minds to befuddle both themselves and Pegasus, you cannot perfectly counter what you cannot predict, and Fiend Comedian is full of surprises. And at number 2, we're firing up a card that's truly goated, and by goated, I mean Blowback Dragon. A 1 tribute Dark Machine with 2300 attack and 1200 defense that released in the 2004 set Ancient Sanctuary, and has an important niche in GOAT format. Once per turn, Blowback Dragon lets you select a card and flip 3 coins. On 2 or more heads, you can pop your target. This is likely a nod to Barrel Dragon, which had 3 cannons in its design, and was the ace monster of Bandit Keith, as well as inspiration for the previously rementioned retrained Desperado Barrel Dragon that was good in Duel Links. While effectively being a retrain of Barrel Dragon itself, Blowback can also fuse with Barrel Dragon to create another powerful coin flip card, Gatling Dragon. This combined monster is powerful and has the potential to destroy as many cards with its 3 flip coins, but its destruction is mandatory, and if you flip heads more than your opponent has cards, you'll be popping your cards on your own board. Blowback Dragon, on the other hand, is much easier to bring out and safer to use. Flipping 3 coins and hoping for 2 heads is kinda silly, because mathematically there are 4 outcomes where you succeed and 4 outcomes where you fail, making this card effect a pretty nifty 50-50 chance with extra steps. Still, 50-50 with no penalty for failing the toss can be only good or neutral, which averages out to pretty okay. But add that 2300 attack is decent in GOAT format, and we're back up to good. And even add to that the fact that you can keep trying for Blowback's pop as long as it's on the field every turn, and Blowback Dragon has a solid claim to being great. It helps that unlike Barrel and Gatling Dragon, Blowback is not limited to removing monsters, and is able to target your opponent's back row as well. This is especially key with the enhanced viability of trap cards in GOAT format. There's also some surprising benefits of Blowback's coin flip effect, in that many cards that protect against destruction like Stardust Dragon cannot negate Blowback Dragon. This is because Stardust Dragon can tribute itself to negate an effect that would destroy a card or cards on the field, and that's not coin flip cards like Blowback Dragon, who only might destroy a card with its effect. This injection of unpredictability interferes with Stardust Dragon's protection. Ultimately, Blowback Dragon places so high in this list because of its generic viability, which is an honor most coin flip cards will simply never see. Yes, its competitive usage in the present is limited to time-locked format, but because of that, Blowback Dragon will never stop being good. A while ago we mentioned Satoris Kumar and his Duel Links skill that made coin flip monsters pretty good by predetermining their outcomes. For the number 1 spot, we're mentioning him again because one of his monsters has one of the most impactful effects in Yu-Gi-Oh! Arcana Force 21 The World is a level 8 light fairy with a premium stat line of 2100 attack and defense. It released in 2008's Light of Destruction alongside Cub of Ace, and on summon it flips a coin. Tails, it's pretty bad news since it adds the top card of your opponent's graveyard to their hand during their draw phase. But as bad as that Tails effect is, check out what happens if you flip it heads. By sending 2 monsters from your field to the graveyard during your end phase, you can skip your opponent's next turn. Notably, this effect can be repeated as long as you have the resources to resolve it during each end phase, leading to the World Lock strategy that utilizes many different collections of recursing cards to keep your field stacked with bodies that you can keep sacking to skip your opponent's turns. Cards that let you skip your opponent's turns are rare. Cards that let you skip your opponent's turn over and over again are almost unique. Another benefit of the world is that if you fub the coin flip, the bad stuff doesn't happen until after your turn is over. Meaning, if you link off or otherwise clear the world from your own board, your opponent will never get to add from the graveyard to their hand. You can even go through the battle phase to enjoy that sweet 2100 attack before clearing the world in your main phase too. With skills that improve card flips, this card may demolish Duel Links if it's ever added without restrictions. But even beyond Duel Links, Satoris Kumar uses Arcana Force support like Light Barrier and Reversal of Fate to manipulate the effects of the archetype of coin flip monsters, which take their inspiration from the major arcana of tarot cards. The dualistic nature of the Arcana Force archetype embodies the spirit of the tarot by having 2 drastically different effects. When reading fortunes using tarot, the chosen card can either be presented normally or reversed, meaning upside down. The twist of fate provides interpretive direction from the core meaning of the card. A common interpretation for the major arcana of the world, for example, is that it represents the wholeness of the cycle of life and the space between the terminus of one cycle and birth of the next. In other words, it is completeness. It is everything. The world. But the world reverse carries different implications, namely a lack of progress, a stagnation. Arcana Force 21 The World exemplifies this effect by creating the impenetrable cycle of the world lock, or stagnating your progress by giving your opponent access to increased card advantage. It's important to note that tarot readings are subjective. There's no universal answer to what a card means, as their ability to bring revelations is a meditative synthesis between the person revealing the cards and the target whose essence is being explored through their relationship to the concept that emerge from the deck. And finally, no list of impactful coin flips would be complete without acknowledging the most important coin flip of all, the one that occurs before the match has even begun. That little golden coin in Master Duel that determines whether you go first or second. This coin flip can feel monumental, even deterministic. But it's important to remember that there are bad ways to win and good ways to lose. What's interesting and troubling is that it's not always clear which is which. A flipped coin doesn't always land heads or tails. Sometimes it may never land at all. Alright, many players will do what it takes to win a match of Yu-Gi-Oh! Add extra engines in the decks, even if they brick, use cards that need dice rolls to activate something, or even play Runic Stun and act like they're lovable people. What we won't risk is doing a coin flip, let alone a deck that is filled with coin flipped effects. Such is the story of the infamously known GX deck, Arcana Force. The entire deck was based around light fairy monsters with coin flip effects that vary depending on your result. Some of them were neat, and some of them, well, weren't. What this deck was perfect for was creating chaos like Sartorius, or people with severe gambling problems. What it wasn't suitable for was any kind of competitive play, as we'll show you in today's video. The Arcana Force would make their flippy arrival Light of Destruction on May 13th, 2008. A majority of the archetype was in the set, with 13 cards appearing. 10 monsters, 1 spell, and 2 trap cards would be the reward. Starting, we have Arcana Force 0, the Fool. This level 1 fairy with 0 attack and defense couldn't be destroyed by battle, and couldn't be switched to defense position. When summoned, you toss a coin and apply the proper effect based on the result. If heads, negate the effects of cards you control that target this monster and destroy them. If it's tails, negate the effects of cards your opponent controls that target this monster and destroy it. This is how every Arcana Force monster operates. They have a trigger summon effect to flip a coin on all of them, and you never know what you're going to get, as the Fool clearly shows. A monster that couldn't be destroyed by battle but needed to be left in attack position so you could feel it punched in the face doesn't scream as a card you should run. The choices from the coin flip weren't really anything significant either. You had a 50% chance of making this card non-targetable by your opponent if you got tails. Seeing this card already suggests that this deck is not that easy to play. Nothing is more stressful than cards than having to hope for a good result. Now let's do this 9 more times with the rest of the Arcana Force family. Because they only get worse from here, because at least the Fool could be set face down and be a battle immune monster, which was still a good effect in 2008. Arcana Force 1, the Magician, was level 4 with 1100 attack and defense, and when summoned, you toss a coin. If heads, its attack is doubled until the end of the turn when your opponent activates a spell card. If tails, your opponent gains 500 life points if they activate a spell card. Arcana Force 3 the Empress was another level 4 with 1300 attack and defense. When you flip a coin on its summon, you can special summon an Arcana Force monster from your hand if your opponent normal summons such a monster if it's heads. If it's tails, send one card from your hand to the graveyard if your opponent normal summons a monster. Arcana Force 4 the Emperor was a level 4 with 1400 attack and defense. All Arcana Force monsters gain 500 attack when its coin result is heads. If tails, they lose 500 attack instead. Arcana Force 6, the Lovers, was another level 4 with 1600 attack and defense. If heads, you can use it as 2 tributes for an Arcana Force monster. If tails, neither player can tribute summon Arcana Force monsters. Arcana Force 7, the Chariot, was 1700 attack and defense. If heads, you can special summon a monster destroys by battle to your side of the field. If tails, give control of this card to your opponent. You have Arcana Force 14 Temperance and Arcana Force 18 the Moon for their high-level monsters. Temperance had a quick effect that allowed you to discard a card to prevent you from taking battle damage from a battle you just had. On summon, toss a coin, and if heads, you have all battle damage you take. If tails, have all battle damage your opponent takes. The Moon is level 7, and when summoned, toss a coin. If heads, you can special summon a Moon token once per turn during your standby phase. If tails, target one monster you control and give it to your opponent during the end phase. To continue the high-level monsters, Arcana Force 21, the World, was a level 8 monster with 3100 attack and defense. If summoned, toss a coin, and if heads, you can send 2 monsters you control to the graveyard to skip your opponent's turn during the end phase once per turn. If tails, however, you add the top card of your opponent's graveyard to their hand once per turn. Finally, for boss monsters, they had Arcana Force EX, the Dark Ruler, and Arcana Force EX, the Light Ruler. Both couldn't be normal summoner set and must be special summoned from your hand by sending 3 monsters to the graveyard. Toss a coin and apply the following effect. For Dark Ruler, if heads, it can attack once again in a row during the battle phase. And if it does so by this effect, it's changed its defense position and it cannot change its battle position until the end of the next turn. If tails, destroy all monsters on the field if it's destroyed. For Light Ruler, if it's heads, target one card in your graveyard and add it to your hand when this card destroys your opponent's monster by battle and sends it to the graveyard. If tails, you can negate the activation of a spell or trap card or monster effect that targets this card and destroy it by having this card lose 1000 attack. Out of all the Arcana Force monsters, it's nice to know the boss monsters' effects aren't abysmal if you're getting either heads or tails. At best, the Dark Ruler can give you a sweeper in battle or a nuke, and the Light Ruler can negate things that target it or recycle cards from your graveyard. However, they didn't have protection from non-targeting destruction removal like how the boss monsters of today have it literally built in. That made it more deterring to run these monsters, as you essentially go -3 to special summon a big boss with nothing and with no protection. The rulers were basically too costly to summon and too risky to play. At the very least, they didn't require your normal summon to be brought out though. Nonetheless, to say a lot is going with the Arcana monsters is an understatement. Effects can range from a minor attack increase from Emperor to continuous effects that special summon monsters like Empress. The same is true for the negative effects they carry. You can suddenly find yourself unable to tribute summon your Arcana Force monsters, giving your opponent their cards back from their grave, or straight up handing them your monsters. This brings us to our first problem, if you couldn't tell. The deck depended on coin toss effects, which made them too random and too inconsistent to count on. Requiring every monster needing a coin flip to succeed in your favor is reliable as thinking everyone showers at regionals. You have no control over the results that happen, and you're at the whim of destiny. Unless you're Sartoris himself and have the power to do so, the monsters completely take the game out of your hands outside of playing them, and rely on luck that you would get an effect that wouldn't screw your game over. The other issue that came into play is that this made it hard to set up a game style. You had no control over your board setup except by choosing a monster to summon. Since you can't decide which effect to use, you don't have any control over combos or responses to your opponent's plays with your Arcana Force monsters due to their inconsistency. Lastly, the deck was slow. On top of the random effects, no search cards were given to the archetype on release, and you had to rely on drawing power outside of the archetype, like Reckless Greed, to dig through your deck. The deck barely had any means of special summoning as well. Empress can potentially give you unlimited special summons, but that's if you got the coin flip correct. There were also cards like Valhalla, Hall of the Fallen that let you special summon a level 4 fairy from your hand, but you needed to control no monsters to use it. It also was searchable with Hecatrice, however that wasn't enough to make bringing out your rulers easy, as they needed 3 monsters to send to the graveyard to summon. The deck was stuck constantly with normal summoning monsters while trying to avoid countless traps that could quickly stagnate your plays. That's not going to cut it in a deck that needs, well, anything to get going. What the archetype needed was a card that could increase its consistency. That request was met with half-hearted results. Light Barrier was their field spell that lets you choose what coin flip effect you want to apply to your Arcana Force monsters when they're summoned, and gives you life points when an Arcana Force monster destroys a monster by battle, equal to that monster's attack power. If this sounds too good to be true, you are an experienced Yu-Gi-Oh player. The card came with the demand of having you flip a coin to get this effect during your standby phase. If it's tails, the applied effect is negated until the end of your next standby phase. Nothing makes a card necessary to a bad deck terrible like using the same gimmick to it. On top of the fact that you keep flipping a coin to get this condition, hopefully you'd wait until the standby phase to take a chance. No escaping the destiny of flipping a quarter at the table to even get the effect that could make Arcana Force stomachable. Arcana Call is the first trap card that selects an Arcana Force monster you control and removes one Arcana Force monster from either player's graveyard. Until the end phase of your turn, that monster's effect becomes the same as the removed monster's effect for the same coin toss. The second trap is Reversal of Fate. If the name didn't give it away, this card lets you target one Arcana Force monster and treat its effect as the opposite coin toss. Arcana Call needs way too much to be utilized. Not only did you need an Arcana Force monster in your graveyard, but you also needed one with an effect that benefited you based on the monster's coin flip. Reversal of Fate was about as decent as it gets, as it at least lets you change your result to something you desired. The only good thing you can say about these cards is that you didn't have to flip a coin to get their effects. However, that's not enough to get through the fact that this archetype was too gimmicky to see good results. A deck with too many various effects, no searchers, and no way to control gameplay is destined for disaster. So, as expected, no one picked up this deck on release. The inconsistencies were too much of a turnoff for anyone to play except for a fun time. The meta was too strong for this deck to have any chance, with contenders like Lightsworns, who hilariously also came from the same set, and Gladbeasts. All these decks had better game plans than the Arcana Force combinations of Light Barrier plus Arcana Force Monster, and Rage and a Coin Toss giving you the desired result. But if it makes the Arcana Force users happy, one card saw a tad bit of play. Surprisingly, the Fool was used in a few top deck lists as it was simply a card that couldn't be destroyed by battle and could stall while you got your pieces. Decks like Counter Fairy also utilized it and melded it with their other fairy support, such as Herald of Orange Light, discarding the target, and an honest target because it was a light monster. So no pitying the Fool. You could pity the rest of the deck as it hadn't seen play for over 16 years. It didn't get support for over 12 years until a random card was given to it in Phantom Rage in 2020. Arcana Reading was a normal spell card that you need to toss a coin to apply an effect unless you controlled Light Barrier. In that case, you get to choose the effect without flipping a coin. The Heads effects lets you add a card with a coin toss in effect from your deck to your hand. If Tails, your opponent gets to add a card from their deck to their hand. It also had an effect that allowed you to banish this card from your graveyard to immediately normal summon an Arcana Force monster from your hand. Even with their Searcher, the deck got worse because of it. Not only was its search effect way too risky, but it now made Light Barrier, which was just as gimmicky, necessary to play. Outside the fact that Reading lets you normal summon additional monsters to set up your summoning for your boss monsters, that setup will still be too slow. It will take your next turn to at least summon an 8 or higher. By then, your opponent could just clear your board easily since archetypes had no protection or spell trap support that interacts with your opponent's plays. Not as if you had to just worry about your opponent screwing up your plans when this deck can maim itself without any help. To finally end the pain of our Coinstar loving archetype, Arcana Force 15, the Fiend, was a level 7 fairy with 2500 attack and defense. This card could be discarded and add a Light Barrier from your deck or graveyard to hand. And of course, it has your mandatory on-summon coin flip effects. If Heads, you can target one monster in the field, destroy it, and inflict 500 damage to the controller when this card declares an attack. If Tails, destroy all monsters in the field if an attack is declared involving this card. Not many Arcana Force monsters have effects that seem beneficial, whether it's the Heads or Tails effects. The Fiend is one of those cards you can include with EX Light Ruler and EX Dark Ruler as cards that give decent effects for either result. It even fetches a Light Barrier from your hand or graveyard, giving you easy access to the card. Unfortunately, the card is hindered by being a level 7 without an inheritable special summoning effect, making this card hard to summon in a deck with very few ways to get extra bodies on board. The deck can barely manage to get cards like Dark Ruler and Light Ruler that need 3 monsters to send to the grave, so it's safe to assume they would struggle to get a simple tribute summon setup for this card. In conclusion, the best way this card can be used is to search for a Light Barrier and eat an Ash for its trouble. That's the note this deck ended on, and it seems like the final coin flip for this deck. Many would say that all the deck needs is more support to make it playable, but that doesn't seem likely. Konami seems hell-bent on ensuring that this archetypes have players bet on a coin flip. Sadly, that's already the impending doom the deck will have to live with. The gimmicky process hinders consistency and does more harm than good. Yu-Gi-Oh! Player decks usually give players a style that'll set up their board manually, or even have a clear-cut direction that players can just run on autopilot without having to do much. Arcana Force offers neither. You're at the whims of probability, a coin, and chaos. You have no direction of how things will go, and it feels like a deck that removes the player completely. Let's add to the fact that this deck is really easy to interrupt and stop, whether it be hand traps, monster effects, spells, or traps. A sneeze from your opponent can also interrupt your destiny and outcome. it's fair to say that this deck should be forgotten in time. It's just not worth the effort of building and flipping a coin 64 times and raging that it only gives you the result you want 2 times. So, would any support really help this deck? Probably not. Not only would the deck still need to have an insane amount of support to make it better, but it will also just need to be able to combat even the simplest of decks, whether rogue, meta, or even just plain casual. There doesn't really seem to be a way to make a coin flip card that sticks to the gimmick like the Arcana Force does, and not punish the player, and overall be an actual sound card. The closest they've seemed to get to that is by most likely using Light Barrier as a catalyst for new support, like how Arcana Reading does, which allows the player to choose the effect if they control Light Barrier. You just have the unfortunate situation of Light Barrier being the string holding the deck together. Isn't that better than the latter, with the constantly flipping of coins, crossing your fingers, and sweating profusely as the effect ends up making you discard cards from your hand, give your opponent life points, make you go back 3 spaces, or whatever Arcana Force forces you to do? At the end of the day, we can all agree that the deck is bad and just recognize that Satoris is one of the most creepy drawn human beings in all of GX. Just play Yubel and enjoy your time. It's time to let Arcana Force rest forever in the GX era and flip its way into oblivion. Cards which require you to discard your entire hand are incredibly rare, and usually tied to incredibly powerful effects, or the complete opposite. In this video, we're going to look at some of these less than stellar effects that require you to discard your entire hand in order to use them, or are just part of their effects in some way. And at number 10, we have Infernity Sage. This is a level 2 tuner monster which has the effect where during your main phase you can discard your entire hand. And that's the entire effect. You don't gain anything for discarding your hand, you're just allowed to discard your entire hand. And funny thing about this card is that it's actually kind of decent in Infernity decks because of its floating effect, where if this card is sent to the graveyard in any way, you can send an Infernity monster from your deck to the graveyard, as long as you had no other cards in your hand when the effect trigger was met. Now, the reason why this card is actually decent for Infernity decks is because they like having tutor monsters that go into their synchro plays, and they like ways of getting Infernity Archfiend or Infernity Necromancer to the graveyard. And both Necromancer and Archfiend require you to have no cards in your hand in order to use their effects. As Infernity Archfiend has the effect that if it's special summon while you have no cards in your hand, you can add any Infernity card from your deck to your hand. And this effect is not once per turn, so normal Infernity combos revolve around bringing out Infernity Archfiend as many times per turn as possible. And since it's a level 4 Dark Monster, it combos perfectly well with the level 2 Infernity Sage to go into Coral Dragon, so you can synchro climb into higher level monsters like Barone. And one problem Infernity decks actually have is getting rid of every card in their hand sometimes. So the ability to send all the cards in your hand to the graveyard could actually be beneficial, even if you gain no benefits from doing so. Which is why this card is only number 10 on this list. Technically, the effect is not very good because you don't gain anything for discarding your hand. But the incredible circumstances revolving around the card and its archetype make it an option that might actually be worth considering, even if it's mostly used for its tuner status and level and floating effect, and not for its ability to discard your entire hand for no effect. And at number 9, we have Spell Chronicle. This is the continuous spell card which has the effect where you can send your entire hand to the graveyard to activate it in order to banish any 5 spell or traps from your deck. Then it has the effect where each time your opponent activates a spell card, you place 1 Chronicle counter on this card. And you can remove 2 Chronicle counters from this card to have your opponent choose one of the cards you banished and add it to your hand. And also, if this card leaves the field, you take 500 points of damage for every card that is still banished by its effect. So, the intended way to use this card was to punish your opponent for activating too many spells by allowing you to get a whole bunch of your cards back with its effect. And since you can potentially go +4 off this card's effects, it required you to discard your entire hand was supposed to kinda balance out the potential card advantage, even though you can just use the card when you only have 1 card in your hand for a minimum discard. However, you only get to add back 1 card per 2 spell cards your opponent activates. So unless your opponent is playing some kind of very spell-heavy deck, you're not going to be able to use the effect very often. In fact, the card never really saw any competitive play because it just wasn't feasible, especially for the cost of having to discard your entire hand. However, there is actually a way to get all the cards you banished for its effect back to your hand almost immediately. In the Witchcrafter archetype, there exists a card called Witchcrafter Patronus. Patronus has the graveyard effect that you can banish this card from your graveyard, except the turn it was sent there, in order to add back any number of your banished Witchcrafter spells with different names to your hand. So, if you simply use Spell Chronicle to banish 5 different named Witchcrafter spell cards, then you can simply use Patronus to get them all back immediately. And if you just simply activate Spell Chronicle when you had 1 card left in your hand, that's a huge plus in card advantage. And because of this interaction, there was actually a little bit of controversy where pro players were hyping up Spell Chronicle as a very valuable card, which manipulated the secondary market into making Chronicle cost a lot of money. However, Spell Chronicle never saw any competitive play, because, funnily enough, the competitive versions of Witchcrafter decks didn't even play Witchcrafter Patronus. If they did play any trap cards, they would usually just use Metaverse so they could search out Secret Village of Spellcasters to lock your opponent down, or just Rivalry of the Warlords for a different floodgate. They just didn't really care about using Spell Chronicle or Patronus to get cards back, because they can instead just use cards like Monster, Get, or Reasoning to get a whole bunch of the Witchcrafter spells into the graveyard, because they all have a hard once per turn effect that adds them back to your hand from the graveyard if you didn't use their hand effects that turn. So, take Witchcrafter Creation for example. This card allows you to add a Witchcrafter monster from your deck to your hand. But if this card is in your graveyard and you control Witchcrafter monster and you hadn't used its first effect, you can add it back to your hand during the end phase with a shared hard once per turn between both of these effects. And since all of the Witchcrafter spells work this way, you can get them all back to your hand very easily by just milling them to the graveyard. No need to do the Spell Chronicle Witchcrafter Patronus combo. And at number 8, we have Rope of Life. This is a trap card that can only be activated when a monster is destroyed by battle and sent to the graveyard, where you discard your entire hand in order to special summon that monster back to your side of the field, and also granted a permanent 800 attack boost. So if you only have one card in your hand, you basically discard one card in order to bring back one monster. Now technically, this is a good effect, because being able to special summon monsters from your graveyard has always historically been pretty good. And 800 attack boost is a pretty decent upside on top of it. However, the problem with the card is that it only brings back a monster which was destroyed by battle specifically, and of course requires you to discard your entire hand, which is a super steep cost. This card was released in the time when cards like Call the Haunted were banned or limited to one copy for being too good at bringing back cards in the graveyard. So the value on special summoning unconditionally from the graveyard was thought to be incredibly valuable. So of course it needed to have all kinds of restrictions on it, but the restrictions were just too much, and Rope of Life never actually saw any competitive play. If it didn't require you to discard your entire hand, it might have, but that restriction was just too much of a detriment, where it was already conditional on only working on monsters that were destroyed by battle. Because one of the reasons Call the Haunted was so good was because you could send a card from your deck to the graveyard with something like Foolish Burial and then just bring it out, which Rope of Life could never do because you can only bring back monsters that you already summoned onto the field properly in the first place. And at number 7, we have Single Purchase. This is a spell card which has the effect where you can add any monster from your deck to your hand. However, in order to do so, you need to have at least 3 other cards in your hand, none of which are monsters, and then you have to banish all those cards face up in order to add that monster from your deck to your hand. Then you have another restriction where you can't summon a monster for the rest of the turn except for the monster with that name. So basically, it's a -3 in card advantage to search one card from your deck, if you go for the absolute minimum number of cards required to use it. And honestly, if it wasn't for the second part of that restriction, the card might have actually seen more competitive play. Because being able to search out unconditionally any monster from your deck is incredibly valuable for all kinds of different strategies. For example, if you search out a Cyberstein, you can just use it to go into a plethora of fusion monsters to stop your opponent from having a chance to win the game. However, because of its second restriction, where you can only summon monsters of its name that turn, you wouldn't be able to summon out a card like Naturia Exterio or Last Warrior from Another Planet. Additionally, because it requires you to banish your entire hand, you'd be hard-pressed to use it with something like Royal Magical Library, a card that is very commonly used in FTK strategies in order to draw every card from your deck, since it has a non-once per turn effect where it places a spell counter itself every time a spell card is activated, where you can remove these 3 spell counters to draw a card. The card allows you to create an advantage machine, where there is a whole bunch of draw 1 cards like Into the Void in order to get free spell counters on Royal Magical Library, in order to eventually draw every card in your deck. However, you need to activate at least 3 spell cards before you're able to draw a single time for Royal Magical Library. And the amount of card advantage you lose for searching it out through a single purchase means it would be incredibly difficult to get the engine online if it was your intended search target. So basically, both of its restrictions kind of make the card unplayable. If you want to bring out a super powerful singular monster from your deck, like Cyberstein, you can't really use its effect. If you want to use a super powerful FTK enabler like Royal Magical Library, losing your entire hand means it'd be very hard to use its effect as well. However, if you're playing an archetype where all the monsters change their name to a single monster, like Cyber Dragons for example, then it could be a way to search cards from that archetype and not really have to worry too much about its restrictions. Except you still be losing a bunch of cards in your hand, and none of the Cyber Dragon monsters are really worth a -3 in card advantage to search them from your deck, nor are any of the Harpy monsters who share a similar distinction of name changing. And at number 6, we have Berserker Soul. This is a quick play spell card which has the effect where if a monster you control is able to inflict 1500 or less points of battle damage to your opponent by a direct attack specifically, then you can discard your entire hand in order to activate this card's effect, where you reveal the top card of your deck up to 8 times, in order to inflict 500 damage to your opponent if what you revealed was a monster. However, if at any point while you're revealing cards you reveal a non-monster card, then the chain ends and the effect ends immediately. So if you're lucky and go into a whole bunch of monsters, you can inflict 4000 points of damage to your opponent with one card, which is absolutely worth a discard of your entire hand, with a minimum of only 1. Because with the starting life point value of 8000 and only having 5 cards in your starting hand, every single card has to deal at least 1600 points of damage for it to be a worthwhile burn card that can win you the game with your 5 starting card opening hand, and Berserker Soul's 4,000 points of damage definitely clears that 1,600 threshold. However, burn decks generally don't play a lot of monster cards, and generally decks that play a whole bunch of low attack monsters that can attack directly like Watts play a lot of spell cards in order to supplement their low attack point values, and can't end games very quickly anyway. So in both these kinds of decks that Berserker Soul might be useful in, it can't really be used effectively in either of them. In order to guarantee that you're going to inflict 4,000 points of damage, you have to somehow guarantee the top 8 cards of your decks are monsters, which you can only really do by playing a full-on monster mash deck, and only one copy of Berserker Soul, so there's no chance you reveal the other copies, which is just incredibly inconsistent for pulling the card off. And in burn decks, the strategy that Berserker Soul is asking you to employ is just not really feasible for these kinds of decks. So while technically the effect of inflicting up to 4,000 burn damage to your opponent is very worth the cost, there just isn't really a deck that can properly accommodate this like Infernity Sage has. And at number 5, we have Ally of Justice Decisive Armor. This is a level 10 synchro monster which requires 1 tuner plus 2 or more non-tuners as its materials. And right off the bat, any monster that requires 2 or more non-tuner materials better have an absolutely banger effect, because that's very hard to accomplish. Because for even less effort, you can go into something like Barone, which only requires 1 non-tuner material, has the same level, and also generic materials. So what does Decisive Armor do? Well, once per turn, if your opponent controls a light monster, you can choose one of its 3 effects to activate, where you can destroy 1 set card your opponent controls, or send a card from your hand to the graveyard to destroy all spell and trap cards your opponent controls. Or you can choose to send your entire hand to the graveyard to look at your opponent's hand. Then if your opponent has any light monsters in their hand, you send them all to the graveyard and inflict damage to your opponent equal to the attack of all those monsters. Now, Ally of Justice Decisive Armor belongs in the Ally of Justice archetype, which is an archetype dedicated to having anti-light monster support for lore reasons, which made them a mess of an archetype to play in actual Yu-Gi-Oh! The Ally of Justice are kind of infamous for being one of the worst archetypes ever created because they center around only countering light attribute monsters. Because if your opponent is not playing any light monsters, most of their effects don't do anything, so you'd be reliant on cards like DNA Transplant in order to make your opponent's light attribute so your effects can actually be live. And DNA Transplant is not a searchable card in the traditional sense, and they don't really have a good in-archetype way of changing your opponent's attributes either. However, Ally of Justice Decisive Armor does have an FTK associated with its hand discard effect. All you have to do is get 2 light monsters with 4,000 attack in your hand, then use Gold Moon Coin to give them to your opponent's hand. Then bring out Ally of Justice Decisive Armor, then get a light monster on your opponent's side of the field, and if you're able to accomplish all this, you can burn your opponent for 8,000 points of damage and win on your first turn. However, anyone who's ever played Yu-Gi-Oh! Should know how incredibly difficult accomplishing all of this in one turn is. And if you're not trying to go for this FTK, then Ally of Justice Decisive Armor is just kind of a bad boss monster, where there's no reason to go into it over the other plethora of generic level 10 synchro monsters. Except maybe back in the day when this card first came out, when there wasn't really other options available, where it just being a 3,300 attack beats deck was actually its main selling point. And at number 4, we have Gambler of Legend. This is a level 4 monster with the effect where you can toss a coin 3 times. Then you apply one of its effects based on the amount of heads you get, where if you get 3 heads, you get to destroy all of your opponent's monsters. Only 2 heads, you get to discard 1 random card from your opponent's hand. If you only get 1 head, you have to destroy 1 card you control. And if you get 0 heads and only tails, you have to discard your entire hand. Now, the Gambler of Legends is in a long line of gamble-only cards, which were made to have incredible upsides if you managed to get the coin tosses correctly, but have incredibly negative downsides if you didn't. And pretty much all of the gamble cards that exist are pretty bad, and this one isn't really an exception. However, it is an upgraded version over Sand Gambler, which has a similar effect but only 2 results based on getting all heads or all tails, where at least Gambler of Legend has a chance to have 2 positive effects based on getting lots of heads. And discarding your entire hand is only an incredibly negative effect that happens rarely. However, it's still not very good nonetheless, because the upsides are just not that good, and the downsides are pretty detrimental if they do happen to you, especially since the card takes up the resource of your normal summon in order to be brought out. It only has a paltry 500 attack, and can't really help push for game if you do destroy your opponent's monsters. Where at least Decisive Armor could be used as a beat stick back in the early days, Gambler of Legend was just a gimmicky card created for people who wanted to play gimmicky decks, and was never meant to be competitive. And at number 3, we have Dicelops. This is a level 4 monster with 1800 attack, which has an effect where you can roll a 6-sided die. Then you apply one of its 3 effects based on the result, where if you roll a 1, you look at your opponent's hand and then discard any 1 card from their hand. If you roll a 2 to 5, you have to discard 1 card from your hand. And if you roll a 6, you have to discard your entire hand. Now, the most beneficial thing about Dicelops is the fact that it's an 1800 attack fire monster with 200 defense, which means it's technically a target for Rekindling, and if it's brought out with Rekindling from the graveyard, it has a pretty decent attack stat that you can use to help beat for a game. However, the actual effect of the card itself only has a 1 in 6 chance of a positive result. as the other 5 and 6 chances are all wholly negative, especially having to discard your entire hand. In fact, it's to the point where it's probably one of the worst gambling cards in the game because the chance of a positive effect is just way too low, and it's incredibly difficult to influence the outcome for a positive result. At least with Gambler of Legend, you have cards like Second Coin Toss, which allow you to try tossing coins again if you want, or Proton Blast, which can guarantee all 3 results are heads by banishing itself from the graveyard. With Dice Flops, your best piece of support is a trap card called Nat 6, which has the effect of allowing you to change a dice result to a 1 or 6 depending on if it rolled one of the other 3 numbers. Where if you roll a 2, 4, or 6, you can change the result to a 1 instead, which means it gives you 3 additional chances to roll a 1, putting it up to a 66% chance of getting the positive result, and completely eliminating the negative result of discarding your entire hand, since it's able to convert a 6 roll into a 1. However, that 6 is not a very useful card for dice rolling card effects, because a lot of them have negative effects on a roll of a 1 or a 6. But technically, it does work with dice flops if you really want to try to get a positive result with the effect to work, as technically, the positive effect is actually good, just not worth the normal 5 and 6 chance of getting an incredibly negative effect. And at number 2, we have Full Salvo. This is a trap card which has a very simple effect where you discard your entire hand in order to inflict 200 damage to your opponent for each card sent to the graveyard by its effect. So if you discard 5 cards from your hand, you get to inflict 1000 points of damage to your opponent, basically allowing you to convert every card in their hand into a Sparks. Now, the actual ratio of cards to effect damage is terrible with this card. As I mentioned earlier, you need at least 1600 points of damage for a singular card to be worth being a burn card, and most burn cards are not worth that. And Konami specifically does not design cards that can burn for more than 1600 points of damage without a whole bunch of restrictions or conditions. And the funny thing about Full Salvo is if you only discard 1 card from your hand, it's basically a worse Sparks, because you're going -2 in card advantage to only inflict 200 points of damage to your opponent, since Full Salvo does not count itself when dealing damage, only the cards in your hand that you're discarding for the effect. So if anything, this card might actually be worse than one of the worst cards in the game, which is a wonder why we have any cards above it on this list. Although you'll see why it's not number 1 on this list once we get to that spot. And finally, at number 1, we have Rocket Arrow Express. This is a level 10 monster with 5000 attack, which is the highest attack a monster can have on a base card, and it has the effect where it can only be special summoned from your hand while you control no cards, and cannot be special summoned in other ways. When this card is special summoned, you can't enter your battle phase that turn, you also can't activate any cards or effects, or set any cards while this is on the field, and during each of your standby phases you have to send your entire hand to the graveyard or destroy this card. So, let me spell out why this card is bad. Basically, what it does is give you a 5000 attack beat stick with no protection that floodgates you from using your card effects, can't attack the turn it's brought out by giving you a summoning sickness out of your entire battle phase, then has a maintenance cost to keep it on the field by getting rid of your entire hand. And since you can't activate any cards or effects, you can't use anything to protect the card. And since it requires a clear field in order to summon, you can't have any floodgates out that would allow the card's big attack stack to shine and beat over other normal summoned monsters, which was a strategy that Malefic Cybernet Dragon would do back in the day with Necro Valley decks. And then, on top of all those restrictions, it can't even attack the turn it's brought out, which is its main selling point. Then you have to get rid of your entire hand during your standby phase in order to keep it out. The only possible use of this card is just to normal summon a monster immediately after you bring it out, then use it to go into some kind of extra deck play. Although the kinds of beneficial extra deck plays you can accomplish when you're not allowed to activate card effects are so incredibly limited that this card is just not really useful even in that scenario, because a lot of cards that could bring themselves out from your hand without using a card effect kind of require you to have a clear field too. So it's not very useful as a beat stick because you can't play with floodgates, and it's not very useful as an Xyz climbing tool because you can't use effects to bring out other monsters, so it's just kind of a useless card all around. And to quite possibly one of the worst cards in the game, that has a maintenance cost on top of all its other negative effects that requires you to send your entire hand to the graveyard, which was really not necessary because the card was already awful before you even account for its maintenance cost.